Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of What If Temari Fell in Love with Banished Naruto. If you enjoy the video then like, share and subscribe for more. So let's get started. Chapter 11. Time skip 3 days later. Sunagaku no Sato. Temari, Gaara and Kankuro walked in through the gates of the village, and saw the villagers going around and a small bit of construction work going on near the buildings in the vicinity of the Kazekage Tower. Gaara and Kankuro stopped at the gate guards and checked in, seeing the Unbu there guarding it, and the Unbu couldn't be happier to see their cave back. They saw Temari and were about to stop her to tell her to check in, when they saw her expression and the small amounts of killing intent she was leaking, and smartly stayed silent, making Kankuro snicker that the elite Unbu were scared of a furious Temari. Gaara and Kankuro followed her to the Suna hospital and saw that there were many people outside waiting and a lot of commotion around the gates. Suna Hospital. Temari came to the gates of the hospital and saw that there were some people crowded at the gates fighting to go in to meet Naruto, and just kept walking silently as the scared civilians and shinobi alike promptly gave her a way to move forward. The Unbu guards guarding the gate moved away, seeing the furious Kunoichi, and knew of her reputation when she was furious, and decided to play it safe and let her go, seeing Gaara and Kankuro following her silently and gave them a curt nod, who nodded back. She walked up to the reception and saw the receptionist there stamping and going through a lot of files, and spoke up. "Which room is Naruto Uzumaki in?" she asked in a low voice that had a dangerous edge to it, which the receptionist didn't notice, and kept going through her work, not glancing who she was talking to. "I has already told everyone Naruto-sama is not to has any visitors unless authorized by the council. Now go, there is a lot of work to do," she said, stamping a paper, and Temari slammed her palm on the desk, making the files fall, leaking a lot of killing intent, causing her to look startled to see who she had spoken to. "I will ask again, which room is Naruto Uzumaki in?" she spoke in a low tone, and the receptionist gulped, seeing she would blow up any minute, and spoke up. "En Naruto-sama is en not to has a any." She stuttered and tried to speak again when Gaara came to her from behind. "Let her pass, she has my authority, and the last I checked I am the Kazekage," he said, and the receptionist beamed at seeing him back and nodded, signing a visiting card that she handed to Temari, who took it with a nod and moved to the secure wing of the hospital guarded by the Unbu, the special and higher level shinobi. She walked through the wing and up the stairs to the 3rd floor, followed by Gaara and Kankuro at a distance, as she came to room 302 and saw Dragon himself standing there as he stood in her path, blocking her entry. "I'm sorry, Temari-sama, but no one can visit Naruto-sama, not even." He was cut off as she slapped the visiting card on his mask and pushed him aside, as a snickering Kankuro and Gaara, with an amused smile, came up. "Well, so much for the respect for an Unbu commander in front of an angry Temari," said Kankuro, laughing, and Gaara nodded as Dragon looked down embarrassed as he watched her slide the door open and go in, closing and locking it behind her. He too wasn't one to stop her entry from seeing her lover as well as seeing her expression, but at least he tried. Gaara put a hand over his shoulder as he looked at his cave and came to his senses, kneeling down. "Kazekage-sama, you has returned," he said stoically, and Gaara nodded as he sat down on the waiting chairs, with Kankuro waiting for Temari to be done so he could see him, if maybe he was alive by the time she was done with him. "Dragon, go and inform the council that I has returned and taken charge, and lift up the emergency protocol. I shall meet with the council at noon after I has met with Uzumaki," he said stoically, and Dragon nodded, listening to his orders. "Dismissed," he said, and Dragon stood up and bowed to his leader. "Ha, Kazekage-sama," he said, and vanished in thin air as Gaara and Kankuro gazed at the locked door with curiosity. "So how long do you think she will take?" asked Kankuro, still keeping his gaze at the door. "I has no idea," he said, also gazing at the door. "Will he be alive after she is done with him?" he asked again, and Gaara answered in his usual way. "I has no idea," he said, and Kankuro nodded. "I wish him peace in the afterlife, he was a good man," said Kankuro in a mourning voice. "Indeed he was, I'll miss him," said Gaara, and both went silent, waiting for the screams to come if there would be any. Naruto's room. Naruto was sleeping and his body was dead tired. Apparently, from what the doctors and Kyo told him, Sasori had come prepared to neutralize him, and the poison was slowing down his chakra healing and cutting off his demonic chakra, which wasn't allowing him to recover as quickly as he did, and was healing at a normal rate, which was really annoying to him. He was glad the bastard was dead, or otherwise he would have created even stronger poisons for him in the future. The little demonic chakra that was flowing in his chakra coils was keeping the poison at bay that Kyo was taking care of, slowly and surely neutralizing it. She herself was surprised at skill of her grandson to create a poison strong enough to neutralize a Vinchurikai like this, cutting off his demonic chakra almost completely. If it had been any other Vinchurikai, he wouldn't have been able to stop the poison from spreading, but she had to admit the King of Demons was a well-earned title, as the Nine Tails was manipulating what little access he had to the boy to the limits. He hadn't felt this tired and drained ever in his life, and wondered if this was what severe chakra exhaustion felt like, and heard a little snort in the back of his mind, but shrugged it off, and went back to his deep slumber, letting the tiredness take over him. An hour later he heard the door sliding open, and it being shut and locked as he felt some chakra being pushed into the silencing seals of the room, seeing them glow, and woke up. This wasn't either Dragon or Kyo, since they had no reason for privacy seals, and the little amounts of killing intent he felt made him cautious. A moment later, as his little senses that he had access to at the moment kicked in, he smiled. He located the beacon of the love of his life behind him, and knew who had done what was going on in the room, and opened his eyes and tried to sit up with great effort, and sat up leaning against the back of the bed, and sat up turning to Temari, breathing a bit heavily from the strain. Temari stood there, her knuckles clenched white in anger and glowing on the inside in all her righteous fury, as she saw the blonde knucklehead that had taken away her sleep the past 3 nights dozing off in a deep slumber, and her anger increased. She saw as his body moved, and she saw the strain with which she sat up, causing a bit of worry in her anger to rise up. She saw him sitting up against the support of the back of the bed, and sighing and breathing heavily at the effort it took, making more worry creep into her, replacing her anger. She saw him glance at her, and saw his skin a bit paler than usual, and his tired eyes and expression, and her heart melted as she saw her hyperactive knucklehead in that condition, but she reminded herself she was still furious with the blonde, and her killing intent returned back as she concentrated it on him, and he looked at her curiously, not at all scared of her. That made her even more annoyed that he wasn't in the least bit of intimidated. Naruto saw his love standing there and smiled tiredly at her, and was surprised as she was leaking killing intent, and that too was intended for him, as he tried to speak up, opening his mouth, but no words came and his throat hurt him. Damn, he shouldn't have shouted that loudly that night, he mused as he took up a glass of water, slowly with tired shaky hands, and took a gulp of it slowly and put it back slowly as a little water dropped from the shaking. Temari saw this, and seeing his shaking hands and how he was having trouble speaking, her anger was again being released as worry was increasing again at the blonde. She cursed him for worrying her so damn much, but told herself that she was angry with him. She decided whatever he said first would be the deciding factor as to what she would do to the cute arg knucklehead blonde. Her words died down in her throat that she was about to thrash him with, as he opened his arms, motioning for her to come to his arms. "I missed you, Mari-chan," he whispered hoarsely in a tired voice, and her eyes watered as all her anger lay forgotten, and she threw herself in his arms, her eyes watering, seeing his weak and frail state. He was supposed to be always grinning and teasing her, not like this. He caught her in his arms and wrapped her up as he buried his face in her neck, taking in the scent of her lovely, silky hair as he let it flow freely halfway down her waist, and let his fingers run through it and held her tightly. Oh, how much he had missed his Heim, he thought, hugging her tightly as she started sobbing and hitting his chest lightly. "Baka, I was supposed to be angry with you for being so damn reckless and worrying me and beat you up. I was supposed to punish you, but..." She stopped her rant in between her sobs as he pulled her head back and captured her lips, running his hands on her waist softly, and licked her bottom lip softly as she opened her mouth, and he kissed her, pushing it in, and she massaged it with her own as it turned into a full-out makeout session lasting 15 minutes as he was more and more into it, listening to her soft moans, and kissed her jawline and neck, sensually making her moan. "Anna-kun," she moaned as he pushed her kimono sideways, connecting his lips to her sweet spot, making her gasp as he ran his hands through the insides of her thighs and massaging them as he kept licking and kissing her sensitive spots softly and sensually, teasing her. She was on cloud 9 as she felt him touch her after so long and take away all her worries and anger in him. She was getting wetter by the minute as she felt both his hands on her thighs, and her panties were now drenched. She was breathing heavily as he felt him on the edge her kimono near her breast, that was her most sensitive spot, and felt him lick it softly, making her back arch as pleasure rock through her body. "Anna-kun right there, more yeses." She moaned as she pulled his head closer and tried to make him go lower to her breasts, but he removed her hands from his head, and kept at the same place, not giving in as she didn't force him, and ran her fingers softly through his hair, and he smiled and kept at it as her chest heaved up and down, her breath heavy as she was so close. He slowly made his way up, kissing her softly on the neck, and reached her ear, pressing his lips and licking and blowing at it softly, making her shiver and clutch him closer to her. Yes, moan my name, Haim. He whispered softly and massaged her thighs softly and pressed his lips on her neck as her head thrashed a bit. No, I won't, I'm angry, she said with a moan, making him smile as he licked her collarbone and went to the spot from before and just touched his tongue as her chest moved up, trying to make him lick, but he leaned back, making her whine, and he again went her ear. You will say my name, Haim, he said sensually, and she shook her head violently from the pleasure, and he smiled, kissing her cheek softly, and went down as she tried to capture his lips. Say it, he whispered sensually, and she shook her head as he bit her neck softly, and she gasped as her stomach churned from the pleasure and pain. Nah, I'm coming, she moaned, and he felt his hands drenched and brought them up and licked them up softly, and she blushed scarlet in embarrassment, and hugged him tightly, stopping his teasing as he chuckled tiredly and closed his eyes, breathing heavily. She felt his breathing was harder than her own and remembered how much effort it took him to sit up and to go through so much would has had a lot of strain as she hugged him tightly to her as he laid his head on her chest and closed his eyes. Why did you do it if you were so tired? She whispered, running her fingers through his hair, and he smiled a bit as his breathing slowed down a bit, and he kissed her neck softly, burying his face in it. Because you were angry and worried and needed a release, Haim. And it was all because of me, I'm sorry I worried you, he whispered tiredly, and she smiled a small smile, kissing the top of his head softly as she whispered. It's alright, I know you can take care of yourself, but I worried too much because I love you too much, Baka. Care about yourself more than me for once, she whispered, brushing his hair as he took in her scent and smiled. Never in a million years will I put myself before you, he whispered, and she smiled at her cute little blonde Baka. Why can't I ever stay mad at you for once? She said softly, and he smiled. Because you love me, Haim, he answered softly, and she giggled. Stop taking advantage, or I might change my mind. She was speaking playfully as he pressed his lips on her and looked at her with a soul-piercing gaze, making her look at him in a trance. Never change your mind about loving me, Haim, that will be the day that I do something really reckless, he whispered in a dead serious voice, and she nodded and gave him a smile as she too pressed her lips on his softly and rubbed his whiskers. I won't ever, she whispered, and he smiled as he kept his forehead on hers and both gazed at each other lovingly. I love you, she whispered, her arms wrapped around his neck the whole time they talked, and he smiled at her faint pink blush adorning her cheeks. And I love you, Haim, he whispered back as she brought his face to her neck, and he snuggled in her arms, making her smile. Sleep now, my blonde teddy, you need the rest, she whispered with a small melodic giggle, and he nodded in her neck. Now I can sleep peacefully, Haim. I missed being in your arms, he said softly, and she brushed his hair as his eyes drooped, and he yawned cutely from exhaustion, making her smile. And I missed holding my Barker in my arms, she whispered as she felt his breathing calm down and the weakness overtook him as she too closed her eyes and cuddled up to him, letting the sleep claim her. 3 hours later, outside the room. They are not coming out or opening the room, are they? Asked Kankuro, his gaze still on the door, and Gaara answered. No, I don't think so, he said, still waiting to see the blonde, and he had tried to get in, but the room was sealed shut with seals, making only Temari or Naruto to open it as they both sighed. I still can't believe he got so many presents, said Kankuro, and Gaara nodded, seeing the pile of gifts that the Unbu had kept at the end of the hallway. And to annoy me further, most of them were from pretty girls or those really chubby cute children, some of who called me different names, he said, his eye twitching at the popularity of the blonde, and how he didn't even care and was crying anime tears on the inside, thinking what he would give to be so popular. Yes, the best were freak face, crossdresser, alien giant cat, makeup man, doll man. He was cut off as Kankuro shouted. All right, I get it already, damn it, he said, and Gaara smiled at riling up the man as he stood up and started walking down the hallways as he spoke up. Come Kankuro, it's time. Let's meet the council and see what has happened in our absence and what needs to be done, he said seriously, and Kankuro nodded, falling in step with Gaara as they walked down to the Kazekage Tower. Kazekage Tower. Council chambers. The council sat down on the round table, murmuring to themselves happily as the Unbu guards that had come to inform them of the meeting also informed them that Gaara had returned, and they couldn't be happier. The room turned dead silent as the doors to the chambers opened and in walked Gaara, followed by Kankuro and Dragon, as he took his seat and gave them a nod. They nodded back. It's great to have you back, Kazekage-sama, said one councillor, and he nodded. It's good to be back, honorable councilman. Now pleasantries can be done later, he said, and they all nodded as he turned to the Thounin commander. I tried to meet with Naruto myself, but apparently my sister in all her righteous fury has locked his room and sealed it shut, not allowing anyone access except her until she is done with him. So I ask you, Baki, what happened while I was out? He asked, and the Thounin commander nodded. Kazekage-sama, it was a normal evening and the village was doing its normal routines, when suddenly a man with a black cloak and red clouds came flying in on a bird, he said as Gaara cut him off. How did he breach the barrier without anyone, especially Naruto, noticing? He asked, and Baki nodded. Yes, Naruto-sama, came to the same assessment, and I looked into it. There was a sleeper cell spy on the inside of our barrier team. The deactivation of the barrier a few days before you left was also the result of him betraying us, he said as the council was in an uproar, and Gaara nodded at the man and held his hand up, silencing them. I expected as much. So has you sniffed out the traitors? And how was he able to operate so freely without anyone noticing? He asked, and Baki nodded. Yes, apparently, Kazekage-sama, the man was having a lot of help from the outside as well as from the inside from one of our elite Thounins. Both has been captured and are currently with the Unbu core of T&I, he said, and Gaara nodded, taking the file and went through the files of the two and motioned to him to go on as he noticed the sudden feeling of pride in his voice and the way the faces of all of them lit up. Yes, well, he started bombing the village with small clay bombs and headed towards the Kazekage Tower where Kazekage-sama engaged him. He said as the events came back to his mind and the power that Naruto emitted and the aura he held came to his mind, and he spoke up. Naruto-sama identified him as Deidara, and then another one came and was identified as Sasori, and then a fight ensued as he went toe-to-toe matching everything they threw at him, all the while protecting us in the battle, but he was getting a bit overwhelmed when we distracted Deidara for a few moments and he and Sasori went one-on-one. The battle was going on to a standstill when Sasori used the variation of Kiyosama's puppetry technique, and instead of 10 he used the performance of 100 puppets that he admitted he used to take down a small village. He said, making Gaara's and Kankuro's eyes widen when they saw the expressions of glee on everyone's faces, and raised an eyebrow. That is when Naruto-sama completely turned the tables on him. He threw 2 of his 4 kunai and used a strange jutsu to multiply them into 1,000 and rained it on the puppet army in the sky. Then he disappeared in a yellow flash as many more similar flashes lit up the sky, and in moments Sasori's army was annihilated and he didn't even know when he was killed. It all happened in just a flash. He finished as he noticed every veteran shinobi's curious eyes were now on Gaara, who had his eyes closed, and nodded. Kazekage-sama, I believe you aren't telling us something, since I see that I and many who have fought in the Third Great Shinobi World War recognize what Naruto-sama did, and, if we are not mistaken, then that was. He spoke as Gaara raised his hand and gave him a stern look, silencing him and sighed, rubbing his temples. Well, I guess the cat is out of the bag now. It's time to reveal everything, he thought as he took out a paper and held it in front of him as everyone gazed at him curiously. This is Naruto's original registration ID form that was misplaced by me when he submitted it, he said, and they nodded, noticing the special emphasis on the word misplaced and the sarcastic tone he held. Naruto told me everything about him and asked me to keep certain points hidden for his and everyone that was close to him safe, but I guess there is no point in hiding anything now. So until I make it official, Naruto is not called Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze and is not the son of Kushina Uzumaki, the princess of Whirlpool, and Minato Namikaze, the Yellow Flash, and Yondem Hokid of Konohagako no Sato, he said as everyone was wide-eyed and most of their suspicions were confirmed as suddenly all hell broke loose. Why didn't you tell us? He really is of royal heritage. That is amazing. The Namikaze lineage lives and that too in Suna. He really is the son of the Yellow Flash. He heard their shouts and sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration as he leaked his killing intent, shutting them up. Silence. He roared and everyone sat down and became silent as he spoke up. You all cannot talk about this for now, until the moment the village is out of chaos, and I shall reveal it to the villagers then. I hereby take you under an oath of silence ordered by your KZ kid to not talk about the Namikaze name until I reveal it. I do not want a war or Kumo to be on our backs when we are rebuilding and sorting everything out. Let Naruto get back to strength and our security systems back online, and then we can reveal it to the village. He said, and they all nodded wholeheartedly with wide grins on their faces at hearing the words they so wanted to hear and to think their hero was the son of such royal and powerful leaders. KZ Kid-sama, then I propose Naruto-sama be put as clan head of the Uzumaki and Namikaze clans and become a clan head, thereby joining the council after he turns 16 next week, giving him the required age to become a clan head as per the laws laid down by the Shodaime KZ Kid. He said, and Gaara nodded with a smile and agreed, making them all smile. Alright, now that is over with, what else did that blonde idiot do while I was gone? He asked, and the whole council chuckled, and he too cracked a smile as Kyo spoke up. KZ Kid-sama, Naruto-sama, has enrolled many civilian children into the academy and stamped their admission papers during his 5-day reign as KZ Kid. There were 27 to be exact in 2 days. Apparently, the civilians and shinobi alike love him and his kind and compassionate nature, and the warmth he emits with the aura of power around him. They has requested him to many things that were wrong and how some of the clans were abusing the small merchants by their power, and he took many steps regarding the treatment of small merchants and civilians and was planning many other things, but the invasion happened before he could work them out any further. These are only a few that he had planned and was working on. She said, handing him a file, and his and Kankaro's eyebrows shot up in surprise as they went through the file. Wow, he really is a work machine. To think these are only a few he had in mind, said Kankaro, and Gaara nodded as they kept reading through it. Indeed, to think he has done so much in such a short amount of time, he said as Kyo spoke up. KZ Kid-sama, there is a proposal the council would like to make if you don't mind, she said politely, and he raised an eyebrow and nodded, seeing their intrigued expressions. Since when did the council become so lively, he mused. We would like to offer Naruto-sama a new position, which gives him more power and standing in the village, seeing his great leadership, skill, and the way shinobi and civilian alike look up to him. After this fiasco, his popularity and influence is going through the roof, as I imagine you would has already noticed, she said, and Gaara nodded, remembering the gifts and the crowd outside the hospital, and cut her off as an idea formed in his head, and he smiled, and the whole council became silent, seeing the stoic cave smile. I has an idea, he said, and they looked at him curiously. From this day on I propose Naruto as my military commander. He shall be my right-hand man and in a position to order the Unbu as well as down in commander. He shall has the discretion to do as he pleases and get it signed by me to make it official, and will keep a good watch over shinobi and civilians, seeing as they see him as a better option to turn to than me. He shall answer to me and me only, and will entail the authority to as many changes be made in the infrastructure of the village, as long as me and the council concur with his decisions and they benefit the village. All those who trust him enough to handle such an important position say has, seeing as the power he will hold only a unanimous vote will. He was cut off as they spoke up. How? They said in unison at the same time, and he smiled and nodded, writing it down on a scroll and passed it around as they signed and stamped it, and he rolled it, sealing it with the official KZ Kid seal, and kept it in his robes. Alright, from this day forward Naruto is the military commander of Sunagaku no Sato. Please make this decision known to the villagers, and let them know after he is up and about to go to him. If I am not there or for some reason they do not wish to talk to me, then he can get the job done in my stead, he said, and they all nodded with a smile. And before I dismiss the council, what the hell is that huge lake in the middle of the desert right beside our village? He asked, and they all smiled. That was Deidara's last attack to wipe out half the village that Naruto-sama deflected there, and the heat was so much that it turned 100 meters of sand to glass, where it exploded, and due to the heat, it rained a bit there, filling it up. If we are to see now, It has become a natural lake seeing as it is big enough to last a few months with the little amount of rain we get," said Ebizo, and he nodded with a smirk. "As you make you really do, has the devil's luck. A mere deflection by you causes a natural phenomenon." He thought and nodded. "Then the broke part of the village will be extended and we will take that lake under our village walls, making it a new part and extending our perimeter. With Naruto's skills in water manipulation, he can fill it up if it ever dries up again, and we can use the water to our advantage and make our lands a bit more lively. Get the builders to cut out pathways across the village grounds and let the water flow brighten the dry lands a bit," he said, and they all smiled and nodded. "Two has water and a bit of greenery was always a dream of every villager, and Naruto could make it a reality. Then the village council is hereby dismissed. I believe that is enough for one meeting," he said, and they all chuckled and left. "That blonde Gaki really knows how to turn people to his side," said Kankuro, and he nodded with a smile as they walked to the hospital to see if Temari was up and about. "That he does," said Gaara, and they walked away. Suna Hospital. Gaara and Kankuro walked towards his room, and Gaara tried the door, and to his surprise, it was unlocked, and he glanced at Kankuro, who was equally surprised, and slid the door open and walked in followed by Kankuro. They stepped in to see the damage to the room, but found none, and was surprised as they stopped dead in their tracks when they saw the scene at the bed. Temari was leaning on an elbow with Naruto's head buried in her chest as she was, brushing his hair softly, and he was snuggled in her chest and completely cuddled up to her. She had a bright smile on her face as she saw the peacefully sleeping blonde she held in her arms. She didn't even notice them come in when she heard a shout. "How the hell does he do that?" shouted Kankuro in disbelief as Temari leaped her killing intent at him, and a moment later her fan buried itself in his face, and he was on the ground rolling in pain. "This is a hospital, you idiot, can't you see Naruto is sleeping? Keep it down," she hissed in a low voice, and he grumbled, rubbing his head, and stood up as Naruto moved a bit from the commotion, and Temari brought his tightly to her chest and kissed the top of his head. "Shh, sleep Naruto, it's nothing, rest alright," she whispered softly as he snuggled into her, making her smile, and his breathing again softened as he went to a deep sleep, and Gaara took a seat at the couch and Kankuro sat beside him, both with smiles as they saw their sister holding Naruto like a plushy bear. "I thought you were going to beat him up and introduce him to a whole new world of pain with your fan," Kankuro said, reciting her words, and she smiled a small smile, cradling the head her lover softly and gently. "I can't hurt him, Kankuro, no matter how angry I am. I love my idiot too much," she said softly, and both smiled genuinely at the love and affection in her voice and the caring gaze she kept at the sleeping blonde. "Then what was the fury you held for 3 days?" asked Gaara, still a bit slow on the feelings department, and she smiled. "I was worried about him, but now that I have him safe in my arms I can rest easy," she said softly, and he nodded with a smile and motioned to Kankuro to come, and they left the room, giving the couple the privacy they needed. "Get better soon, Naruto. I miss your energy and teasing already," she thought, and herself went to sleep cuddling to him, as Gaara closed the door slowly and smiled as he took one last glance at the cuddled couple and closed the door shut. Chapter 12. Sunegaku no Sato. Next morning. Our favorite blonde couple was sleeping in a deep sleep with small smiles on their faces as our hero had his arms wrapped around his Haime's waist, and she had her back against his firm chest, and both were spooned to each other as our whiskered-faced hero's eyes were hidden in the silky blonde hair of his Haime. The nurse came in along with Kyo to see the cute scene, and both smiled as the nurse went to the window and opened up the curtains as sunshine hit the faces of our favorite couple, and Temari's eyes fluttered open a bit groggily. Naruto buried his face in the back of her neck and hid his face in her hair, sighing happily as he kissed it softly, and Temari blushed as she felt his lips on her neck and his breath feeling a bit ticklish. She saw the nurse, with a blush on her face and her hands on her mouth, and Lady Kyo had an amused smile on her face as her blush deepened when she realized her position. Instead of feeling embarrassed, she turned around in his arms and placed her lips over his softly and her arms around his neck, as Naruto's eyes opened when he felt something soft on his lips and brought her closer, pressing his own lips over hers, and broke off with a smile as she pecked his nose softly and giggled. "Morning, Naruto," she whispered softly, and he smiled. "Morning, Mari-chan," he whispered back equally softly, making her smile. Kiyo faked a cough to get their attention, which they promptly ignored, and Temari placed her forehead against his, gazing intently into those cerulean pools she loved so much. Naruto gazed into those teal-green eyes that mesmerized him so much, and his heart warmed up at holding his Haim in his arms and tightened his hold on her waist, and she snuggled closer, pressing herself against him, and kept staring into those eyes as she put a hand on his cheek and rubbed those whiskers he loved so much, softly making him close his eyes and lean into her touch, and she smiled. "How are you feeling, Naru-kun?" she whispered, and he kept his cheek on her hand, as she kept rubbing those whiskers, with her thumb a bit, making him purr, and she giggled. "Much better now that you are here," he whispered, and she smiled and pressed her lips on his softly and broke off with a smile. "All right, now I'll go and get freshened up, and you take care of the two ladies behind me," she said softly, and he frowned a bit. "Is it necessary?" he asked, annoyed to her to let her go, and she giggled and pecked him. "Yes, it is, Barker, now let me go, so you could get checked up," she said, and he shook his head and hugged her tightly, making her smile as she brought her lips on his ear. "If you let me go, and be a good boy, then I might give you a little gift," she whispered, trailing her finger on his cheek, and licked and kissed his neck softly and pecked him softly, and he blushed a scarlet, and let her go, making her giggle as she kissed his forehead and stood up, walking to the bathroom with a sway of her hips as he followed his gaze to her, and just as she was closing the door, she winked and gave him a flying kiss, and his blush deepened, but he kept staring, and she closed the door with a giggle. Naruto-san, can you sit up, so I can check you up?" asked the nurse, who was blushing a deep red herself, seeing the interaction, and saw that he didn't hear her and was still staring at the door. Kiyo saw this, and her smile widened at seeing his tranced face. "Naruto?" she asked, shaking him a bit, and he turned to her as she saw his glazed eyes and faint pink blush. "Ho!" he whispered intelligently, and she sighed, shaking her head, and the nurse giggled. "This idiot doesn't think twice about battling two S-class ninja or fighting an army, and look what effect Temari Haim has on him with just a touch. I swear she could kill him and he wouldn't even know it," she said tiredly as she slapped his head on the back harshly, and he snapped out of it and glared at her. "Hey, what did you do that for?" he asked indignantly, rubbing his head, and she sighed. "You really are hopeless when it comes to her, aren't you?" she asked, and he blushed and stuttered out a no, making her sigh and the nurse to laugh. They got onto him, and he took off his shirt as Kiyo went about and worked on his torso, slowly extracting the bit of poison that the demonic chakra had pushed towards the wounds, and checked his other wounds, and the nurse spotted everything down on the medical chart as Temari came out, having brushed and washed her face as she had combed her hair into a single high ponytail coming to the middle of her waist, and saw his naked torso and blushed a bit. Naruto caught her blush and grinned. "Like what you see, Haim," he said teasingly, and she blushed harder and glared at the grinning blonde. "Shut up, you Barker. Why would I be embarrassed? That chest belongs to me." She trailed off at his grinning face and the amused expressions of the two ladies, and blushed harder as she glared at the snickering blonde, making him laugh harder at her cute expression, and she dumped him on the bed, making him yelp. "Now look what you made me say, now I'll show you," she said, and started tickling him as he giggled and was glad that Kiyo had closed up all his wounds and she was taking full advantage of it. "Stop, Haim, I'm sorry. I was just kidding, it hurts," he said, laughing, and she smiled and stopped as she laid on him and put a strand away from his face, gazing into his eyes with a smile and a blush. He put his face in her neck and kissed it softly. "I belong to you, Haim. Why would you be embarrassed about that?" he whispered, making her blush, and she held his head tightly close to her and closed her eyes. "I wasn't embarrassed, I was just..." She trailed off as he grinned at her. "Being teased?" he asked, and she nodded. "How being teased?" she said innocently, and trailed off as she realized what she had said and glared at him, puffing her cheeks. Kiyo and the nurse saw that they were too caught up in their moment, and left, leaving their breakfast on the side table, and closed the door behind them. You are so. She trailed off, wondering what to say as Naruto finished it off. "Cute?" he asked, and she nodded savely. "How cute?" She trailed off as he laughed at catching her again, and she growled and bit his neck softly, making him gasp and giggle. "I didn't know my kitten had fangs," he said, chuckling as she blushed and buried her face in his neck, and he laughed a bit as he brushed her ponytail and laughed at her, obviously embarrassed, hiding. She knew she couldn't beat him at teasing and sighed, as she kissed his lips softly and gave him a heart-warming smile. She saw the breakfast beside the bed and smiled as she sat up, and he pulled her on his lap and she put the tray over hers and started peeling an orange as she put a slice in his mouth, and he bit her finger a bit, making her glare and him giggle. She started peeling an apple and kept feeding him as he held her in his arms and his chin over her shoulder. Then she remembered the special day that was a couple of weeks from now and smiled. "Narukun, do you remember what it is 2 weeks from now?" she asked softly, and he smiled and kissed her neck softly, making her smile, and rubbed her stomach softly, making her feel fuzzy and warm there. "Of course I do, Haim, how could I forget? It is the day that I proposed my angel to be my girlfriend, right?" he whispered softly, and she smiled and rubbed his cheek and nodded. "So what will you get me?" she asked timidly, and he raised an eyebrow at her timid voice and knew that she wanted something and was too embarrassed to say it. He turned her around as she looked down playing with her kimono, and he put his finger on her chin and brought her gaze to his eyes and smiled at her warmly. "What do you want, Haim?" he asked softly, and she blushed and averted her gaze as he cupped her cheek and brought her face to him and pecked her softly. "Tell me, what do you want, and I promise I'll make it happen," he said softly, and she looked up with a blush. "You promise to get me anything I ask for?" she whispered timidly, looking at him nervously, and he smiled and nodded. "Really?" she asked timidly, biting her lip as her blush turned a rosy pink, and he kissed her forehead, softly cupping her cheeks, and smiled and nodded as she squeaked out something that he didn't hear. "What was that, Haim?" he asked curiously, and she again squeaked out something playing with her shirt, and he smiled. It must be something truly embarrassing to her if she was acting this way. He brought her chin up with his finger and gave her a smile. "Haim, I can't get you what you want if you don't tell me properly," he said softly, and she bit her lip and nodded. "I want you," she whispered softly and looked down playing with her kimono, and he tilted his head to the side in confusion. "You already has me, Haim, remember?" he asked, and was confused as she shook her head. "No, I want you," she whispered softly again, and he was confused at her demand, not understanding a word. She looked up and he saw her eyes watering and her bottom lip quivering, and now he grew worried. Whatever she wanted must be truly important to her, he thought, and cupped her cheeks with his hands and kissed her tears away softly. "What do you want, Haim? Tell me," he asked softly, and a tear rolled down her eye as she answered him. "Marry me," she whispered softly with a sniff, and his eyes widened in shock at her words, and she saw his shock, and tears rolled down her eyes as she buried her face in her hands and cried. "I'm such an idiot. I shouldn't have said that to him. A girl never asks a boy for marriage. He must be thinking I'm so stupid. I ruined everything. Please don't let him be angry." Her thoughts were cut off as he grabbed her hands and pulled her close in a passionate kiss and wrapped her up in his arms, sitting her up in his lap, and their lips moved in perfect sync. He ran his fingers on her waist, feeling her every curve of her curvaceous figure, and both opened their mouths at the same time and massaged each other's tongues, connecting their mouths completely as he pulled off her hairband, letting her flow, and buried his hand in it and pulled her closer as she did the same, pulling him closer by his neck and deepened the kiss. Both were lost in their own worlds as they broke off the most passionate kiss they had ever had, and Temari saw that his eyes were glazed and she was still crying as he hadn't answered her. "Naruto, I." She was cut off as he dove in again, and captured her lips again, pushing his tongue completely in her mouth, and dominated her completely as she moaned when he pulled her closer by the waist and ran her fingers through his hair. He broke off, both breathing heavily as she saw him, gazing at her with a flushed face and a swollen lower lip that she had bitten slightly, and she kissed it softly, and he grunted a bit in pain and pleasure, and she licked it a bit, cleaning the blood, and was surprised as he captured her tongue in his lips and massaged it with his own, making her moan, and he broke off, and she saw as a tear rolled down his eye, and she was worried that she had hurt him when he again captured her lips and surprised her, but she kissed him back equally lovingly, trying to make up for her stupidity, and thought that he must be putting out the pain, he must be feeling it, not fulfilling her request. He broke off the kiss and saw as she sniffed, and pressed his lips, this time so softly that she melted in the chaste kiss and almost had her orgasm from the pure and loving lip lock that he gave her and broke off as she saw his eyes that held all the love and warmth in the world to her, and was transfixed with his gaze as she saw his lips move and words come out that took her breath away. When he whispered and her eyes widened as tears rolled down her eyes and he chuckled as she threw herself in his arms and wrapped his Haim up in his arms safe from the world, and into his warmth with a chuckle as he held the hysterically crying girl in his arms rubbing her back softly as she cried in his neck and cooed the girl softly and held her close to him. She cried in his arms for half an hour, and broke off a bit as he still held her close and saw her sniffing and wiping her eyes, as he saw her look so adorable with those red puffy cheeks and eyes and those small soft and supple lips that were a bit swollen from their intense kisses. He watched her wipe her eyes with the sleeve of her kimono, and smiled as he cupped her face and wiped her nose with his hanky and she giggled a bit in that sweet, melodic voice and he smiled and he pulled her close. He put her face in his neck and his chin on her head as she wrapped her arms around his waist, and buried her face in his neck pressing up against him, and he held her by her waist rubbing it softly calming down her sniffing a bit. After 10 minutes he saw her relax completely in his arms and pulled her off the hug a bit and she looked at him curiously. "My Haim is so adorable with those puffy cheeks and eyes." He cooed and she blushed in embarrassment at his voice as he treated her like a child and he giggled and kissed her forehead softly. "And don't you feel embarrassed, because no matter how dangerous you get you'll be my cute little Haim forever," he said in a cooing voice and she giggled at his stupid words and started hitting his chest in giggles muttering "Barker. You idiot, why couldn't you have just said yes? I was so scared that I had lost you. You complete Barker Barker Barker," she said hitting his chest with tears, and he chuckled as he hugged her stopping her hits. "And who's the Barker really?" he asked and she looked at him curiously and looking so cute with that adorable face that he kissed her puffy cheek, making her giggle. "To think you thought that I would even has to think of that, we are engaged and I was the one who really rushed it, not you, my Barker Haim," he said chuckling as he saw her adorable face turn all the more red and she hugged him tightly to hide her embarrassment as he held her tightly with a laugh. They sat silently cuddling as Naruto asked a question that had been bugging him. "Why did you ask her marriage so suddenly, Haim?" he asked and she sighed and buried her face further in his chest and he held her tightly. "I am scared, Naruto," she whispered and he frowned at her answer, but let her speak her heart out. "Why?" he asked gently and she stayed silent for a few moments then spoke up. "Because of what happened during my time in Konoha," she whispered and his frown deepened and he tightened his hold on her. "What happened in Konoha?" he asked softly though on the inside anger was bubbling up, and he wanted to hear her answer. "They tried to get me to marry the Uchiha for an alliance," she whispered and the temperature of the room dropped a few degrees and his eyes turned cold. "They what?" he asked in a low voice trying to rein in his temper and she hugged him tightly calming him down. "They tried to force me into a political marriage with him and that bastard tried to flirt with me and eyed me like a piece of meat," she whispered as killing intent flooded the room and Naruto was getting furious by the minute and she decided to calm him down. But Gaara refused completely and, when they tried to trick us into an alliance that benefited only them, he told them off completely. But Tsunade will come during the finals of the Chunin exams to the final talks. "Naruto, I don't want to be forced with marriage to anyone besides you. I would kill myself if..." She was cut off as he gave her a gentle chaste kiss and rubbed her cheek softly. "Haim, I would tear that village along with that bastard if they even tried to lay a finger on you," he said and she nodded as a tear rolled down her eye, showing her fright and he hugged her close to him. "Haim, that Uchiha, he didn't do anything to you, did he?" he asked and she giggled and pecked him. "As if that bastard could even touch me, I would castrate him with my blunt fan first before he made a move on me," she said and he chuckled softly at her fiery temper knowing she was very much capable of carrying out the threat if needed. "Haim, you aren't doing this only because you are scared." He was cut off as she looked at him with a hurt expression, and he felt ashamed for asking such a question. "Do you think so low of that I would?" She was cut off as he hugged her tightly stopping her. "No, I don't want you to be forced into anything, Haim. I didn't mean it like that," he said softly and she nodded in his chest and hugged him tightly. "You didn't tell me when, Haim." He asked playfully, and she giggled and put her arms around his neck and her forehead against his and gazed at him lovingly. The same day you proposed me to be your girlfriend, she whispered, and he nodded and kissed her softly. All right, he whispered back, and she giggled like a schoolgirl, making him confused as she spoke up softly, hugging him. I'll loosen up that wallet of yours, with a whole lot of shopping now. Let's see how much you've saved all these years, mister, she said, and he smiled and kissed her neck. Shop all you want, Haim, but there is one thing that I will buy for you, he said, and she looked at him curiously, and he smiled. Your wedding dress. I has an idea for it in which my Haim will most likely make my heart stop, so leave that to me, all right? He asked, and she nodded with a smile. All right then, I'll choose your clothes and the rest we'll shop together. I'll do everything I has dreamed about and make it perfect, she said dreamily, and he smiled and kissed her forehead softly. We'll make it perfect, Haim, he said, and she nodded with a smile, liking the way we sounded. So now you will has to change your name and reveal your heritage, Narkan. I am going to be Temari, Namika's right, she whispered softly, and he nodded with a smile at the sound of her name. I was already going to reveal it as soon as I was up and about, but I guess we'll do it at our wedding, all right, he said, and she nodded happily that he was going to take up his father's name, and then she would get to be his wife. An hour later the door slid open as he saw Gaara come in and gave him a smile as Gaara too smiled seeing the two cuddling, and was followed by Kankuro, who took a seat beside him. Azumaki, the council has been pretty happy with your work and has decided to give you a new position, he said, handing him the scroll, and Naruto took it and unrolled it, and his eyes widened as he read each line again, and Temari too was stunned at the contents of the letter. Are you serious? He asked, and Gaara nodded as he stood up and put a hand on his shoulder. Naruto, Azumaki, I Gaara no Sabaku the Godame Kazekage of Sunagaku no Sato appoint you as the military commander of the village. Do you accept? He asked, and Naruto nodded with a smile. Ha Kazekage-sama, he said formally, and Gaara nodded and turned to Temari with a sad smile. Temari, you will has to leave to the Leaf Village next week. He was cut off as Naruto spoke. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Gaara, he said, confusing Gaara, and he continued. We put in a leave application for a month, he said, and Gaara glared at him. Azumaki, you know her mission. The council will need a very solid reason. He was cut off as Naruto pulled her closer by her waist and kept his head on hers with a smile. We are getting married in 2 weeks, Gaara, he said, and Gaara stood there stunned with wide eyes, but was broken out of his thoughts as they heard a thump behind them, and turned around to see Kankuro on the floor unconscious, and he sighed, face palming, and the blonde couple chuckled. I swear he won't live long if you keep doing this, he said with a sigh, and turned back to them with a smile. Alright, that is a good enough reason, but she will still be in charge of the preparations as well as the liaison to the dignitaries in the finals that I cannot help her with, but your leave I will get approved, he said, and Naruto nodded with a smile. Congratulations are in order then, he said, and they shook hands as Gaara hugged him, shocking the two of them, and looked at Naruto with a smile. The family just got bigger, he said, and Naruto and Temari nodded with a smile as he picked Kankuro up with his sand and went out, giving them the privacy, but Naruto stopped him. Gaara, I will reveal my heritage at the marriage ceremony and take up my father's name, he said, and Gaara nodded. The council already knows, since most of them were veterans, and recognized your fighting style from the last battle. It's about time too, he said, and Naruto chuckled as he walked out with an unconscious Kankuro in tow. 1 week later, Naruto was released from the hospital, having been fully healed and up and running, as he walked with his Haim wrapped up against his arm through the village streets as they entered another shop for some marriage decorations. He watched as Temari went through every little detail she wanted, and he just stood back answering her questions every once in a while and paying for everything. The council had happily approved of the marriage leave, and Gaara had sent a message to Konoha letting them know of the absence of Temari and had apologized for the inconvenience, and Tsunade had made Shikamaru the complete in charge for the first 2 parts of the exams. The whole village was in buzz as they heard their favorite couple announcing their marriage and were eagerly waiting for the ceremony to happen, though there were many broken hearts among both the male and female population. Naruto watched as the men looked on in jealousy at him while the women were giving the same glances to his Haim, and were blushing at him, and he sighed as he watched Temari going on happily about the various plans of the marriage, half of which went through his head, but he tried to listen and understand everything she said and gave her a small kiss every now and then, making her beam and more enthusiastic. He himself couldn't wait to finally has his Haim as his wife, and a chance to start a loving and happy family in a village that respected and accepted him completely. Meanwhile in Konohagako no Sato, Tsunade sat in her office as she read the scroll from Suna and grinned as she called Shizune, and she came in and saw the smile on her face and knew she was up to something. "Get me Shikamaru Nara, Shizune," she said, and Shizune nodded as she called to him, and 15 minutes later the lazy-ass Nara entered the office lazily with a yawn. "You called Hokage-sama?" he asked with a yawn, and she twitched at his laziness but then smiled. "Yes, Shikamaru, I did. You see, I just got a message from the Sand Village, saying that Temari has been granted a leave due to some personal important things in her life and their council has approved it," she said with a smile, and he looked at her curiously. "Then how will she help me with the first 2 parts of the exams?" he asked, and his smile widened. "She won't," she said, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't mean?" He saw cut off as Tsunade spoke up. "Tune in Shikamaru Nara, you've been hereby given the complete authority to the first 2 phases of the tune-in exams, while the 3rd part shall be taken care of by Temari completely. So I suggest you get to work," she said, grinning at his stunned face, and after a moment Shikamaru sighed. "Troublesome blondes," he said, and Tsunade's eye twitched. "You want some extra duties too, I presume then?" she asked sweetly, and he sighed again. "Troublesome," he said, and Tsunade developed a tick mark on her head as she threw the bottle of sake at him, and he dodged and ran off, as he heard a shout. "Now get to work before I get my hands on you, you lazy ass," he heard, and walked out with a sigh as he bumped into the person he least expected to and gazed at the curious eyes of the last precious Uchiha. "Hey Shikamaru, I was just looking for you," said Sasuke, and Shikamaru sighed as he yawned and wondered how he would get all the work done on his own. "What do you want, Uchiha?" he asked in a dismissive tone, as Sasuke twitched, but shrugged it off as he looked behind him. "So where's Temari? I thought she was with you to help in the preparations of the first 2 phases of the exams," he asked curiously, and Shikamaru sighed. "She isn't coming to the leave for the first 2 phases, and has been granted a leave by her village for some reason, and will complete the preparations of the last phase all on her own," he said, and Sasuke frowned. "Damn it, there goes my chance to win her with my charm and make her mine. But oh well, I'll swipe her off her feet in the finals then," he thought in glee as he imagined the Suna princess falling in his arms and her beautiful body in his arms, and saw Shikamaru staring at him blankly and coughed as he shook off his thoughts and realized he had spaced out. "Oh well, then I suppose that you has a lot of work to do then," he said, and Shikamaru suddenly had an idea. "No, you are lucky I found you here, Uchiha. Tsunade-sama just ordered me that you will be helping me for the final phase of the exams, and now, it saves me time to find you. I volunteered you myself," he said, and Sasuke frowned. "And why the hell would I waste my time with that stupid stuff?" He was cut off as Shikamaru spoke up. "Oh, I just thought how much you wanted to win Temari over and how she would be so grateful that you took her place and organized the exams so well in her stead," he said as he saw the smile and look of dreaminess on his face and smirked. "Hook, line and sinker. And that's checkmate, Uchiha," he thought, laughing in his mind as he saw Sasuke break out of his thoughts and nodded. "Alright Nara, we will organize this as best as possible, and with the perfection of an Uchiha, then Temari will realize how much I want her to be mine," he said, and Shikamaru nodded as he saw Sasuke go in to ask Tsunade to make it official. "He is so easy to manipulate. No wonder he went to be Orochimaru's bitch so easily," he thought, shaking his head as he followed him inside and had removed the burden from him completely, courtesy of an easily manipulated and stupid Uchiha. Chapter 13. Time skip 1 week later. Sunagaku no Sato. A week had passed and the Sabaku estates were bright and fully decorated as the day the whole village, the Sabaku family and especially our 2 favorite blondes had been waiting for had finally arrived. The whole open area of the compounds were decorated with some of the most expensive food from the village lined up on the tables to the sides. There was a special stand to the side that had been kept covered for later, and was to be opened by someone specifically. Kankuro stood at the entrance of the compounds for the first time in a normal suit and without makeup as he welcomed the guests to the wedding ceremony with a smile. Temari had specifically threatened him not to wear any makeup or bring any of his dolls to her wedding, or only Kami herself would save him from her wrath. Needless to say, he hadn't argued to any of those points, even though he thought it was war paint and battle puppets inwardly and thought they were really cool. Naruto and Temari's bedroom. Naruto-kun, moaned Temari as Naruto captured her lips and was laid on over her, completely pressed on her. She had her hand in his hair pulling him in and the other on his neck while he had her waist straddled and his hand in her open hair as he pushed his tongue in and their tongues battled for dominance, and he gave her a lip lock again as he broke off, breathing heavily, and saw the flush face of Temari and her rosy pink blush as he kissed her cheek softly and buried his face in her neck and kissed it softly, making her smile and snuggled in her arms. She giggled softly as he looked at her curiously, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and their foreheads touched as she gazed at him lovingly and with a bit of longing as she bit her lip softly. Today is the day, Naruto-kun, and here we are, making out instead of getting ready for the wedding. She whispered softly, and he chuckled as he gave her a soft kiss on the lips and rubbed her cheek softly. And when has we been a normal couple, Haim? He whispered softly, and she giggled in her melodic voice that warmed his heart and made him smile. Are you nervous? She asked with a blush, and he nodded with a smile. How? He said honestly, and she looked at him with a worried glance. Why? She asked gently, and he smiled as he kissed her forehead softly and gave her a heartwarming smile. Today is the most special day of my life, the day I complete the dream that I has had since I was a child. Has a loving wife to hold, who would be at my side no matter what, and spend my life with her. I know that it is even more special to you, and I don't want anything to go wrong. I want it to be the most special day of our lives and one which we remember forever with smiles on our faces. He answered honestly and softly, and she smiled as he washed all her nervousness away and kissed him softly and rubbed his whiskers, making him lean into her touch as she smiled. Don't worry. The most important thing is that I has you by my side. It will be the most special day of our lives and everything will be perfect as long as I'm with you. You want to be with me too, don't you? She whispered softly, and he smiled warmly and nodded as she saw the love his eyes held as he spoke up. I won't exchange the chance of being with you for anything in the world, Haim. He said softly, and she kissed him softly and nodded with a smile as Naruto sat up and put her on his lap, brushing her hair softly as she kept her head on his shoulder and sighed happily. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Azumaki, the guests are arriving already. Get ready, you guys are about to be married anyway. Fool around later. Came the stoic voice of Gaara, and Naruto sighed, and Temari giggled with a blush hearing his voice and words, then got up from his lap as she redid her hair in a high ponytail and turned to him with her hands on her hips and a mock glare with a playful smile on her face as she tapped her feet and looked at him, an angry mother, though the ever-present blush took most of the effect off, making her look all the more adorable in his opinion. And where is my dress, mister? You better not have forgotten it. She said in mock anger, and he smiled at her as he walked to the closet and pulled out a wrapped package in an elegant wooden box as he walked to her and put in her arms as she clutched it to her chest softly, and Naruto smiled as she looked at him lovingly. You'll love it, Haim, I promise. He said softly, rubbing her cheek, and she smiled with a faint pink blush and nodded as she hugged him tightly, and he wrapped her up in his arms with a soft chuckle. Now where are my clothes, Haim, or should I come out in my boxers? He asked playfully, and she giggled, hitting his chest softly, muttering Barker, and looked at him with a smile. And risk all the girls in the wedding jump you belong to me and me only, mister. She said sternly, and he nodded with an amused smile at her protective nature, and obediently muttered a how as she nodded with a small smile, and walked to the bedside table and pulled out another elegant wooden box and handed it to him with a smile. You'll love it too, Koibito. She whispered softly, and he took the box with a smile and nodded as she started to leave when arms wrapped around her waist from behind and pulled her close to a firm chest, making her smile as Naruto put his chin on her shoulder and kissed her neck softly, making her moan. I can't wait for tonight, Haim. He purred in her ear, making her shiver and blush a scarlet red as she looked down, fiddling with her shirt as she whispered. Hami too. She whispered softly in embarrassment, and he chuckled softly and kissed her cheek, making her smile as their cheeks touched and he held her to him firmly and she melted in his arms. Naruto, let me go, I have to get ready too. She whispered half-heartedly, not at all struggling or wanting him to let go, and he smiled as he turned her around and hugged her as she hugged him back tightly. She was worried about his sudden silence as she felt a tear drop on her shoulder and tightened her hold on him. What's the matter, love? She asked in a worried and soft tone, and he buried his face in her neck. Nothing, it's just that I'm too happy. He whispered, and she smiled and nodded in his chest as he broke off the hug and let her go as she wiped his eyes with her sleeves and kissed his cheek softly with a blush and rubbed his whiskers softly. Get ready, all right, I'll meet you in a bit, she said with a wink and went out as he chuckled and went to the room that Gaara used and saw him standing there stoically, his arms crossed and his eyes closed. He opened his eyes as he saw Naruto come in and his hand closed the door and locked the room as Naruto gave him a nod and he nodded back. So as you Uzumaki, or should I say Namikaze, the day is finally here, ho? He asked and Naruto nodded with a smile. It is, Gaara, I can't believe it's already been 3 years and I'm going to marry my Haim, he said softly, and Gaara nodded with a smile as he put a hand on his shoulder and he looked in his eyes to see the look of respect and admiration in the Godame Kazekage's eyes as he spoke up. Naruto, you are the only one I would want to see my sister with and trust her with for life. You were always a part of our family, but today, even the formalities are completed. Keep her happy, Naruto, that is all that I ask, he said, and Naruto nodded, smiling genuinely at his best friend. I love her more than anything, Gaara. You know that I would give anything for her happiness. And I am happy that we are now officially a family, Gaara, he said, and Gaara smiled and nodded as he hugged him, shocking the blonde who hugged him back, and Gaara stepped back and Naruto was shocked as a tear rolled down his eye. Keep her happy, he said, and Naruto nodded with a smile as they shook hands. Alright, I'll let you get ready then, hurry up before the guests start throwing a tantrum, he said, and both chuckled as he walked out, and Naruto opened the box and was wide-eyed at what his Haim had bought for him and smiled as he put the clothes on. In the compounds, Kankuro, Gaara and Baki were welcoming the guests to the seats as they all saw the arrangements. Naruto and Temari had insisted that it be a small affair, between close friends and important people only, with Gaara agreeing wholeheartedly in the matter. He saw as all the guests were seated and Kankuro walked into the house to fetch the blonde-whiskered hero, with Matsuri doing the same for Temari. A few moments later they saw as Naruto walked down, and the whole crowd's breath was caught in their throats as they saw the blonde coming down the aisle with Kankuro in tow. He wore a simple blue shirt with exquisite embroidery of navy blue flames at the bottom with the same navy blue pants matching it. But the thing that caught their attention the most was the white cloak he wore over it. The cloak was just like his jacket, with the blue flames adorned at its bottom, and the same blue color on the inside, with golden patterns adorned in various parts of the cloak, and a 5-pendant necklace that he wore on his neck. His blonde, unruly hair came up to his eyes as he walked down the aisle with the confidence and an aura of power around him, as all the men looked on at him with respect and read the vertical Candy the second flash written in blue on the back of his cloak as he stood at the aisle at the ceremonial altar and waited for his Haim to come. His breath hitched as he saw his Haim come down the aisle with her hair done in a loose bun with a gold pin and a ruby at the end of it and 2 bangs adorning her face. He watched the pure white kimono with the same blue lilies at the bottom of the kimono that ended at her thighs, showing her toned legs that were covered with white stockings from down the knees and white heels on her feet. He watched her face as she only had the light pink lipstick on her lips and the little eyeliner and blushed eyelashes as her mouth was covered with a small translucent white veil. He couldn't even begin to compliment how beautiful she looked as he saw the stares of lust the men were giving her, and unconsciously leaked killing intent them as they gulped and shook their heads, with Gaara doing the same as they both looked at each other and smirked. Temari blushed at their reactions and was flattered that he had remembered the kimono she had worn on her first date. It was the same design her mother had once worn on her wedding, and her blonde Barker had gave her the dream she always had to wear that on her wedding. She saw his blush on his cheeks and the loving gaze, and smiled at him under her veil, herself blushing as she saw him look so drop-dead gorgeous in that attire she chose for him. She licked her lips a bit as she imagined what she would have to do when they got alone, and shook off the thoughts as she felt nervousness take over when she reached the aisle on the altar and stood beside him with the desert lily bouquet in her hands, as both turned to Gaara, who nodded at them both. "You look wonderful, sister," he said, and she nodded, smiling under her veil, and nodded as she looked at her to-be husband, and both looked into each other, with all the love they could muster, and back at Gaara, who smiled and cleared his throat, getting everyone's rapt attention. We are joined here today to witness the holy matrimony of our two loving lovebirds, he said as all of them chuckled, and Temari looked down in embarrassment as she spoke up. Naruto, as you make Namikaze, do you take Temari no Sabaku to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to be true to her in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love her and honor her all the days of your life? He asked Naruto, who smiled and nodded. I do, he said, and Gaara nodded and turned to Temari with a smile. Temari no Sabaku, do you take Naruto as you make Namikaze to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to be true to him in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love him and honor him all the days of your life? He asked Temari, who smiled and nodded. I do, she said, and Gaara nodded as he spoke to the crowd. Is there anyone who has any reason for which he shall want to stop this marriage? Under the witnesses, Kankuro no Sabaku and Matsuri Yukata should speak now. He asked the crowd, who smiled and shook their head in unison, and he nodded and turned to the couple in front of him. The bride and the groom may exchange their vows, he said as Naruto went first. With this ring, I give you my promise that from this day forward I will give you all my love, and you shall not walk alone. I has no greater gift to give. As your love is my anchor, and your trust is my strength, may my heart be your shelter and my arms be your home. As this ring has no end or beginning, so shall my love to you be. As I place it on your finger, I give you all that I am, and all that I shall become. I will love forever and beyond my love, he said as he took the ring that he gave her to the engagement from Kankuro and slipped it into her finger, and she went next. I Temari no Sabaku take you, baby-faced one, to be my husband, my friend, my lover, my tormentor, my companion in life, and my instigator in trouble. I will love you unconditionally, support you in your goals, honor and respect you, without too much sass except on Fridays. I promise to love you faithfully through perfect times and the merely fabulous times, regardless of how often you are at boy. I hereby promise to resist the urge to beat your ass when you are difficult to get out of bed. In the presence of our family and friends, who insisted on bloody tagging along, I offer you my solemn vow to be your brat in sickness and in health, despite your Nancy boy whining. In good times and in bad, and in joy as well as in sorrow, I give you my trust, my love and my soul. I will forever and ever be yours, and even the times beyond my love, she said, and he smiled as she took the new platinum ring matching her own and slipped it into Naruto's finger, and both turned to a smiling Gaara as they heard the "OWS" and "so cute" from the background and ignored it as he nodded. So through the mutual consent of this loving couple in front of the eyes of everyone present, Gaara no Sabaku the Godame Kazikud of Sunagaku no Sato declare Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze and Temari no Sabaku husband and wife. May Kami bless your marriage and your love stand strong through the rifts of life. You may kiss the bride, he said, and Naruto smiled and walked up to his Haim, who looked at him and wrapped her arms around his neck as he removed the veil and saw her shining pink lips, and lowered his own as he captured them in a deep and loving kiss, and the whole crowd stood up and clapped brightly as Gaara smiled and held Kankuro by the shoulder, who was releasing streams of tears and crying heavily. They broke of the lovely lip lock and saw the faint blushes on each other's face as they kept their foreheads together and gazed at each other lovingly. I love you, Naruto whispered, and she smiled as she pecked him softly. I love you more, Temari whispered, and he smiled as he broke the hug a bit hesitantly, and Naruto held her close by the waist as she kept her head on his shoulder, and both walked down into the crowd with Gaara as they greeted the guests, as all of the clan heads and council members along with the important people and many simple civilians who Naruto and Temari knew greeted them, and handed them their presents, wishing them a happy marriage as Naruto and Temari smiled and met each other when Gaara clinked a glass, gathering everyone's attention as they all looked at him. Alright, the food has been served. There are delicacies of the best chefs from all over the elemental nations, but there is one stand that you all must have seen is still covered. This was arranged by my sister, especially for her newlywed husband as a surprise, and I request the couple to please come forward so that we could unveil it to the person it was intended for, he said, and Temari smiled and pulled a bit confused Naruto to the front, who looked completely lost as she smiled at him and kissed him softly, and he kissed her back as he looked at her curiously. Haim, what has you arranged to me as a surprise, no less? he asked, and she smiled as she took the small scissors from Kankuro and cut the small ribbon on the cloth as it fell, and the stand was unveiled, and Naruto gasped as he read the board and looked at the two chefs in front of him. Ichiraku's ramen was displayed proudly in front as Chuki and Iame smiled at their favorite blonde fondly as Chuki called the stunned boy, breaking him out of his stupor. "Yo Naruto, my boy, congratulations on bagging such a beautiful angel. Now come on, sit down. Tonight the ramen is on the house," he said as the whole crowd chuckled, and Naruto's eyes watered as he moved around the stand and hugged the both of them happily. These were the ones who had hidden him from mobs and fed him when he had no money. The father and daughter smiled and hugged their whiskered blonde boy back happily as he sobbed. "I'm glad you two are here. It wouldn't have been the same without you, Ayame-chan, and especially you, Chuki-san," he said, and both smiled warmly as Chuki broke of the hug and chuckled wholeheartedly. "Look at you, these desert people don't know how to feed my boy. Let's get that solved. Now sit down and let's have you some of that Naruto special ramen you always used to have," he said, and Naruto and everyone chuckled as Temari watched their interaction fondly. She had requested them to come here, and had arranged everything for them in the village with a restaurant in the most popular part of the shopping district with the help of Gaara. "So many would you like, kid? Hope you haven't lost the touch?" asked Chuki as he started boiling ramen, and Iame giggled while Naruto chuckled happily. "Didn't this bring back memories?" he thought. "Keep them coming, old man. It's been a while since I had the food of the gods," he said, and Chuki chuckled as Temari sat beside him. "That's my boy," he said as he worked on his ramen, and Iame turned to the happy guests. "Would any one of you like to eat ramen tonight? I know it's not a thing for marriages, but we will serve anyone if they want," she asked, and everyone nodded and raised their hands as Temari and Naruto chuckled, while Chuki laughed wholeheartedly, while Iame's sweat dropped as she started noting down the orders. "Now people here know how to eat real food," he said, and all of them chuckled as they too wanted to eat what the groom and their hero was so infatuated with. "Thank you, Mari-chan, you gave me the best surprise I could have asked for," he said, and she smiled and nodded. "I've arranged a restaurant and their living needs here, love. Now Ichiraku's belongs to Suna along with its #1 customer," she said softly, and his eyes widened as he saw the old man nod and hugged her tightly, saying thank you, and she giggled and hugged him back as she watched him eat ramen and ate herself. This was the most unusual delicacy any wedding must have had, she mused as she watched the happy faces of the guests and thought that their business would certainly boom here, especially with her ramen-loving blonde teddy by her side. They all laughed and ate ramen as the other chefs started helping Chuki, and the waiters helped Iame as it was a wedding where only ramen ruled supreme. The whole crowd of guests started moving out as Naruto, Temari, Gaara, Kankuro waved them off and thanked them for coming as Gaara turned to Naruto and pulled out a small box as Naruto took it with a raised eyebrow, and Gaara smiled. "That's our present to you two. I certainly do hope so that you'll like it," he said, and Naruto and Temari looked at each other and smiled as Temari hugged her two baby brothers and thanked them, kissing their cheeks as they blushed in embarrassment, making the blondes chuckle as Naruto opened it and saw a pair of keys with a small note and opened it to find an address that was just beside their house. Actually, it was their front house, and Naruto looked at him confused, and Kankuro and Gaara grinned. "Yo blondie, we don't want to hear any more noises tonight and sleep peacefully. So go on and break the new bed at your new house now," said Kankuro, and Temari blushed at his words but let it slide just for today as she hugged them both again, and Naruto tried to say it was too much, but Gaara said he would have none of it. Gaara and Kankuro waved them off as they walked to the empty house in front of them, and Naruto opened the door to the house as they stepped in the mansion. Naruto saw it was a traditional old Japanese two-story house with lots of open space and walked in as they explored the living room and the kitchen as well as the various other rooms and saw the garden with a small koi pond in the middle. They moved upstairs and opened the master bedroom as Naruto saw the king-sized bed and the closet as well as the bedside table, and thought it must have cost Gaara quite a bit, since this was the most expensive part of the village's clan grounds. Chapter 14. Time skip 2 days before the start of the finals for the Chunin exams and 2 weeks since Naruto and Temari's wedding. Sunegaku no Sato. Naruto woke up as the sun rays came in through the window and hit his face. He yawned and stretched his body when he felt something snuggle into his chest and gazed down. He looked at the free-flowing hair of his blonde girlfriend, now wife, and smiled. He kissed the top of her head, and pulled her closer by her slender naked waist and let her cuddle up to him. They had enjoyed their first week of marriage a lot, but then much to his charging, her responsibilities for the finals had come up over her. He too had been working hard, but not nearly as hard as her. She had to take care of everything from the preparations, to the places where the dignitaries would stay, the official food stalls, and betting areas. He had taken over her duties for the responsibility of security for the finals from her and Gaara, who too had been buried neck deep in paperwork. He rubbed her back softly as she turned around, and he pulled her to his chest, making her back press against his firm chest. He put his cheek over hers and knew she was awake now and just playing to be asleep. He pressed his lips on her cheek softly and nibbled her ear softly in his teeth. "You know, if you are awake, then you shouldn't act like you're asleep, Haim. Let me see those pretty teal-green pools of yours." He whispered softly, and she smiled and opened her eyes with a cute yawn, turning around in his arms and gazed into her husband's eyes lovingly. "Hey you," she whispered softly, making him smile and kiss her softly with a chaste kiss, and brought her close, hugging her. She snuggled in his arms, and Naruto brought the blanket up, covering their naked bodies up to their necks. "So how has the preparations been going, Haim?" he asked, and she sighed tiredly and pressed herself to him, saying nothing, making him chuckle softly. "So it was that tiring, huh?" he asked playfully, and she nodded in his chest while he kept brushing her hair with his fingers. "Please don't ask me about it. None of those idiots know anything to do without my guidance. Please tell me you took care of all the security measures nicely," she asked softly, and he nodded, pecking her with a smile. "Of course, love, there's nothing to worry about. All the shinobi will be notified of their security protocols today by the Unbu and Thounin commander personally. I kept everyone in the dark until the last moment, so no leak could be made for any breach of security," he said, and she smiled and hugged him happily. He heard the bell to the house ring and was surprised at the sudden interference. "Were you expecting someone, Haim?" he asked, and she shook her head innocently. He nodded and got up, making her whine. He chuckled and captured her lips in a soft, gentle kiss and rubbed her cheek softly. "I'll see who it is, all right, Haim," he said, and she nodded, pouting at the lack of her morning cuddles, and he put on his pajamas and walked out of the room and down the stairs. He opened the door and saw Matsuri standing there and was surprised at seeing her this early in the morning. "Ohio, Matsuri, do you need something?" he asked politely, and was confused at her blushing, but realized he wasn't wearing a t-shirt and smiled in amusement at her staring. He waved his hand in front of her, and she broke out of her stupor with her blush intensifying. Namikaze-sama, Kazekid-sama wanted me to inform you and Temari-sama that she would have to welcome the dignitaries arriving today at noon. He also asked me if you has prepared all the security measures or not," she said politely, and he nodded. "All right, I'll inform Temari of the welcoming arrangements. Tell Gaara not to worry about the security arrangements, the plans will reach him at lunch on his desk. Tell him not to worry and handle all the other diplomatic stuff and leave this to me," he said in an authoritative voice, and she bowed and nodded at the military commander of Suna in respect. "Has you had breakfast, Matsuri? Would you like to come in?" he asked politely, his earlier authority now forgotten, and she smiled and shook her head. "No, it's very generous of you, Namikaze-sama, but Kazekid-sama needs me with him today. I must decline," she said politely, and he waved his hand dismissively, and she left. He closed the door, walking into the kitchen to prepare the breakfast. He started cutting the vegetables with precision when two arms snaked around his waist, and his love hugged him from behind. "Are you already bored of me, just after 2 weeks?" Temari asked in mock hurt, and he brought her in front, making her hold the knife, and started cutting the vegetables, putting his chin on her shoulder, making her blush. "How can I get bored of my Haim, especially when you were so amazing last night?" he purred in her ear, making her blush harder, and she elbowed him with a giggle. "Pervert," she said with a giggle, and he chuckled, kissing her neck. "And you say that after your moans last night, especially when after the third time you moaned, please Narcon one more time, ah?" he teased, whispering in her ear, and she turned red like a tomato and turned around, burying her face in his chest from embarrassment, and he chuckled. He kissed her neck softly and brought his lips to her ear. "You've spoilt me," she said with a schoolgirl-like giggle, and he chuckled softly himself. And you spoilt me, Haim. He said softly, and she nodded in his chest. He picked her up in his arms bridal style, making her squeal in glee as she snuggled in his chest and walked into the shower. Both showered and got out as Temari walked to the closet and started getting dressed. You know that I have to meet the dignitaries and foreign convoys today to the welcoming. And still you do all that just before I have to get dressed. What if I had a limp from all that? She asked in mock anger, and Naruto chuckled softly. Well, you didn't seem like complaining back then, he said, making her blush. And it would be fun seeing you explaining it to the others, he said, and dodged a hanger as he chuckled, seeing her blushed and embarrassed face as he saw her in her black laced bra and panties, and moved forward and pinned her to the wall. Plus, if you keep blushing like that wearing this, I might have to make you miss the welcoming and give you that limp after all, he whispered in her ear huskily, and she hugged him tightly. What am I going to do with you? She asked tiredly, and he smirked. Well, you could. He was cut off when Temari put her fingers on his lips, shutting him up. Oh hush, it was a rhetorical question, my Barker blonde husband, she said softly with a giggle, and he pecked her and put her down, walking back, putting on his cut sleeves white shirt over his blue unboo pants and sandals, and fastened his blue fingerless gloves with metal backplates. He finished off his attire with his signature white waist-length jacket with blue flames at the bottom and the candy the second flash embroidered vertically down his back. He tied his headband on his right arm, letting his hair fall free over his eyes a bit, as he had kept them the normal size to avoid the heat but grown them slightly to fall over his eyes as his love liked it so much. He was putting on his white medical tape when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Temari coming out from behind the wooden dressing separator. He dropped the roll of medical tape when his eyes landed on his wife. There she stood in a black, thigh-length elegant kimono without her usual fishnet stockings, letting the toned legs out in the view completely. Light blue flames matching his jacket's color completely were designed to give the look of a large desert lily, and her hair done in a loose bun with a senbon holding a shining blue sapphire at its end, accentuating his eyes and her hair. The light blue obi matching the pattern at the bottom of her kimono was done beautifully with the same design embroidered on it. She was wearing her usual black shinobi sandals at the bottom and no makeup, just the way he liked it, and just stared at her in a trance. Temari had a rosy ink blush adorning her cheeks from his reaction, but was shocked at his words. You should not go out like this, he said, and she looked down thinking she wasn't looking nice, and was stunned at his next words when he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her in a hug. I don't want others to see my Haim looking so pretty, he said, and she blushed and hit his chest lightly, muttering Barker, and giggled. His heartfelt compliments and soft kisses that came with them made her feel really special. Naruto kissed her lips softly just like she knew he would, and she rubbed his cheek softly, making him nuzzle in her hand, and she smiled. Haim Matsuri came in the morning to tell you that you had to welcome all the dignitaries at noon, he said softly, and she nodded as he picked her up bridal style, and she squealed gleefully, snuggling in his chest happily. He walked down to the dining table and sat her on his lap, and both ate the breakfast he had kept earlier, slowly making slow soft talk about each other's days. Naruto saw it was almost 11 and they had to leave in 10 minutes to get to their posts, and hugged her, burying his face in her neck, making her smile. You don't want to go, do you? She asked with a giggle, and he whined in her neck as she cradled his head with a fond smile, brushing his hair softly. They sat in silence for 10 minutes as Temari got up from his lap and fixed her kimono properly and put her hands on her hips with a playful glare. Now let's go, or do you want me to get late for my welcoming? She asked in mock anger, and he smiled. Well, I could make you get late and spoil that pretty kimono a little if you'd like, he said, making her turn red like a tomato and bonk his head. I didn't mean it like that, you Barker. Now come. Escort me at least halfway, where we will have to part ways, she said, pulling his hand, and he went, with her locking the house behind them. They walked through the streets with Temari wrapped around him, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist, securely as they walked through the village with smiles. Everyone either smiled, waved, or bowed at the newly married couple, and they walked on, reaching the central square of the village, and Naruto saw Gaara and Kankuro waiting for them and raised an eyebrow. He saw Kankuro handing Gaara some money and grumbling, and was confused. Hey guys, what's all that give take about? He asked, and Kankuro huffed while Gaara smirked. We just made a bet that whether you would make her come late, or not after seeing her in her attire as our representative for our exams, that she had to wear for 3 days. Kankuro said you would, and just paid up. He said, and Naruto chuckled at the makeup man's expense. Oh, believe me, I was sorely tempted. He said, making her blush and hide in his neck as he hugged her and kissed the top of her head. The brothers watched happily at how happy their sister was. Alright Haim, I'll go and take care of all the shinobi stuff while you and your brothers go and have fun with the delegates, alright? He said, and she nodded and broke the hug hesitantly, missing his warmth. Thanks for taking over all the stuff for me, Naruto, I appreciate your help. Gaara said, and Naruto nodded, as he waved and watched them leave. Temari took a couple of steps and turned back, running up to him and threw herself in his arms as he caught her in his arms and twirled her around, making her giggle happily. She kissed him passionately as the crowd watching them was cheering on in happiness, and the Sabaku sibling fiddled around uncomfortably. It was hard seeing their sister seeing her kiss someone, even if it was her husband, they thought, and the couple kissed for a couple of minutes as they broke off looking flushed. What's wrong, Haim? What is with this all of a sudden? He asked, putting a lock of hair behind her ear, and she smiled and pecked him. Nothing, just like that, she said, giving him a wink, and pulled her brothers with her to the gate, and Naruto smiled and shook his head in amusement, walking away to the Kazekage Tower into his office to take care of all the militaristic stuff while Gaara handled the diplomacies. Village gates. Temari, Gaara and Kankuro walked to the village gates at a slow pace and came up to the gates. The Chunin standing there bowed to the three, and Gaara nodded to them as they sat down. Gaara knew that there were Unbu place everywhere if he knew Naruto, but to the life of him, he couldn't see a single one since this morning. He saw how the commanders of both Unbu and the Thounins looked up to him and how they had started reporting to him, and was glad at the burden being split from him with some of the civilian affairs that Naruto had taken away from him too, and watched over the activities of the council. He had offered the hat to him, but the damn blonde had given him such a great answer with a smile that he had speared where he stood with his sand before he flashed away and still cursed, the damn blonde, to his answer. Oh, you can keep the hat. Kami bless you with all the more paperwork, Kazekage-sama. He had blessed him, and that annoyed him to no end. He saw as the several carriages and people came into view and held his stoic mask on, while Temari smiled to welcome them all. It was the first time that all the 5 great villages had sent their genin teams to the exams after the civil war in Kiri had ended. The main reason being Suna was the most neutral, major village at the moment, and every village wanted to scout them out with all their new defense systems cutting them off. Temari welcomed the party from the Earth Country with the Sandaime Tsuchikage Onoki, Akatsuki and Kurotsuki at the front along with their daimyo. She greeted and welcomed the guests, sending them off with their personal Unbu escort teams to the Desert Oasis, the finest hotel in Suna. Awa was completely neutral with them now, as all their past differences of the last war were being forgotten, and they were moving up from it. Next came the delegation from Kumo with the Yondem Reikide Dali and C at the front, along with their daimyo, and she greeted the rigid and shrewd man politely who nodded, respecting the kunoichi. He viewed strength, and the Wind Mistress of Suna was a well-known name in the bingo books now. And he also saw the elegance and grace with which she carried herself, making him respect her even more. She greeted everyone and sent them off to the hotel with their own personal Unbu team, and the rest of the parties with the Genins and Thounins were being sent to another hotel assigned to them by Suna Chunins. Unknown to them, the whole village was riddled with hidden Unbu Black Ops, keeping eyes on everyone and wearing heavy Uzumaki chakra suppression seals, making them the eyes that reported directly to Naruto, watching their every move for security. She saw the delegation from Kiri come into view and was nervous at how this was going to play out, since relations had always been tense with them ever since the last war with what her father had played on them. She saw a really beautiful and seductive woman wearing the Mizukage's hat along with her 2 bodyguards and smiled, greeting them, and was happy that they weren't holding any hard feelings. Maybe with the new Mizukage, their relations could be improved, Gaara mused, welcoming her personally. They were escorted to the hotel with the same detail. Temari had chosen the hotel personally, seeing it had many different buildings like a resort, and would keep the different villages away while at the same time together. Lastly came the last delegation, and Temari frowned a bit but smiled, concentrating just on the woman wearing the Hokage's hat and the only leaf shinobi she respected apart from her apprentice Shizune. She welcomed them as Tsunade took off her hat and took the hands of the young girl in hers with a gentle smile. "You look lovely, Temari, absolutely beautiful," she said happily, and Temari smiled as they hugged each other lightly. Temari scowled inwardly seeing her two bodyguards and gave them a polite bow and smiled. She wanted to bash the head of the white-haired pervert into the ground as she saw him, eyeing her like a piece of a meat, but she couldn't and just settled for inwardly cursing him to hell. "Welcome to Suna Hatake-san, Freya-sama," she said as politely as she could, and they nodded with smiles, and she saw two thounins behind her that made her snort in disgust inwardly. Shikamaru and Sasuke stood behind them with the fire delegation, eyeing her carefully, and both frowned as she dismissed them without even sparing them a glance. Sasuke saw her looking so beautiful, and the elegance with which she walked and held herself made him want her even more. She would be the perfect matriarch to the Uchiha clan and a fine partner for him to revive his clan, he thought, licking his lips as he watched her greet everyone with that entrancing smile on her beautiful lips. And now she had a new glow on her face that wasn't there before, which made her look all the more entrancing to him. He would as her see him like this when he saw her fiancé in the finals, he mused, grinning. Several others of the rookie teams were there too, and she wanted to just tell them to fuck off, but diplomatic things stopped her, and she motioned to them to the escorts to the hotel as they left. She welcomed them all and many others from several minor villages like Waterfall and Grass, and sighed as the last of them left. "Thank God it's over," she said, sighing tiredly as she plopped down on a nearby bench, and the tune-in at the gates handed them bottles of water, which she took gratefully. "Well, there are a lot of people this time to the exams," Kankuro muttered, gulping down the water, and Gaara nodded. "Yes, these are the biggest finals ever in the history of the 5 villages. There has never been the gathering of the Big 5 at one tune-in exam finals. It will be good for diplomatic talks between our villages," Gaara said, and Temari nodded, knowing it was true. Her thoughts trailed off to her blonde Baka as she stood up tiredly and saw the setting sun, and looked back at her brothers with a tired smile. "Guys, I'll be heading home now. Naruto will be back by the time I reach home. I want to rest till tomorrow before the finals," she said, and they smiled and nodded as she walked away to her home with a small tired smile. Namika's residence. Temari walked in through the stone steps and saw the house still locked and frowned. She had hoped her would be home, but it looked like he was running late. She walked in, keeping her sandals in the shoe rack, and walked straight upstairs. She went inside her room and fell straight down face first on her bed with a tired sigh. Suddenly she felt a presence behind her when she felt 2 hands press against her back and massage it, and smiled. "My Haim looks really tired tonight," spoke the loving voice of her husband as she felt him massaging her back and thighs, and sighed happily, moaning as he broke the tiredness off her. "A little down, she moaned, and Naruto worked his hands on her back, gently massaging it, and took the small fans from her sleeves as he squeezed out the muscles in her arms. He flipped her around and saw her tired face and half-lidded eyes, making him smile. He undid her obi and opened her kimono so only her black-laced bra and panties were in view, and picked her up by the waist, softly removing her arms from the sleeves, and put her in bed, hanging the kimono on the wooden separator. He brought the blanket up and tucked her in as he saw her fast asleep already, and rubbed her head, kissing her forehead softly, and changed, getting into bed beside her. He knew she would wake up in the middle of the night, and he would make both of them dinner then, and snuggled with her as they cuddled up and slept in each other's arms. In the dead of night, Temari's eyes opened as she felt her snuggled up to her hubby and without her kimono, as she smiled seeing Naruto cuddled up to her, and knew what must have happened. She kissed his lips softly, and Naruto woke up with a smile. "Hey you," she whispered softly, rubbing his cheek, and he smiled. "Hey yourself, princess," he whispered, and pecked her, hugging her in his arms. "You didn't eat dinner, did you?" she asked, and he shook her head, making her smile. "You don't have to sleep on an empty stomach just because I did it," she said softly, and already knew the answer that was about to come. "How could I eat when my Haim was sleeping on an empty stomach?" he asked softly, and she smiled and pecked him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kept her forehead on his, gazing into his lovingly. "I'm hungry," She whispered softly and he smiled and pecked her. You want to eat at home, order something, or go out? He asked softly and she smiled thinking of her options and smiled happily coming to a decision. Let's go out a midnight date. She chirped happily and he nodded with a smile getting out of bed and put on a simple t-shirt over his pajamas and she wore a simple pink top and her white floral pajamas, tying her hair in a loose bun and both walked downstairs putting on their sandals. They walked in their usual way as Temari snuggled into his warm body to escape the cold breeze and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close to him. They walked through the almost deserted streets and into the shopping district of the village where some people were still up and about and walked to a small restaurant and Temari pointed to it as they walked in. The manager of the small establishment saw the most popular couple of the village come into his restaurant in simple, sleeping clothes and smiled at seeing the newlywed couple snuggled into each other. He walked up to them and greeted them politely. Namikaze-sama, it's a surprise seeing you here at this late hour, he said, and Naruto smiled at the man and nodded. Yes, well, Mari-chan slept on an empty stomach and I followed her. That led to our midnight date tonight. I hope we can get a small corner for ourselves seeing our simple attire. He asked politely and the man beamed and waved his hand dismissively. Of course not. This place is always open for our favorite couple. Please come with me, I'll get you a nice quiet booth, he said, and they smiled and followed him as the few people that recognized them widened their eyes when they saw them and greeted them happily. They sat in a corner table on the second floor completely empty and to themselves near the window and Temari giggled, making him curious. This has got to be the best date ever. I mean, we just got out of bed and came out at almost 2 in the morning on a date in a small restaurant completely without thought, she said, and he chuckled and nodded as the manager came, and they ordered some sushi and a little sake as they chatted about the day's events, and Naruto chuckled at her descriptive curses for the delegates as the food came, and both ate, sometimes feeding each other, and had a bottle of sake shared with each other. Not much since they wanted to enjoy but be fit for the finals. And Naruto could always keep his alcohol in check if he needed due to his tenant watching over him. He and the fox had gotten pretty close over the years. Well, as close as a human and a bloodthirsty Bivo could get with his heavy sarcasm. They had a mutual respect to each other, as the fox had told him of his life and Naruto had told him about his, which he already knew and which was why he respected him, and especially his mate Vixen as he called her, who helped him out from darkness before he did something stupid. The demonic chakra beacon on her ring was his idea, and he was always keeping his senses out whenever he was a little careless, not wanting to see his container be beaten due to his carelessness, and disrespect him. Naruto knew underneath all that bloodthirstiness, he was just an overgrown plushie. So I saw Sakura here today with many of the rookies from the Konoha delegation along with their Thounin senseis, she said in between her eating, and Naruto brought her hands to him and kissed them softly, looking at her lovingly. You don't have to worry about anything, love. I has no feelings for anyone other than you. Neither will I ever have, so don't worry about anything. Almost all of Konoha except a select few died to me when they betrayed me. My heart belongs to you and only you, he said, sensing her emphasis on Sakura, and she smiled and drank her warm sake slowly and nodded. He took all her insecurities away with just that loving look. She was scared that if Sakura was to come to her senses he might re-emerge his feelings for her. She knew she was being stupid, but the slightest chance of losing him scared her to no end. They saw as the manager walked up to them and asked if they needed anything, but they shook their heads and paid the man with a good healthy tip and thanked him for the hospitality, leaving. They walked through the barren streets when Naruto saw a little girl running with tears streaming down her eyes and frowned. He crouched down and caught her in his arms as she hugged him innocently and cried her heart out while Naruto held her softly, rubbing her back. Now my little angel, no need to so many precious pearls, he said, wiping her eyes and nose, and smiled as he gazed into the teary brown eyes and puffy cheeks of the small black-haired girl and gave her a gentle smile. The small girl recognized Naruto seeing his whiskers and smiled happily. You're him, Whiskers-kun, she chirped happily, and Temari giggled, causing him to glare at her, and he too recognized the girl from that day when her father came to him for her admission to the academy. But what was such a little girl doing here in the dead of night? What are you doing here, Ha-chan? It's late, and why are you alone? He asked, and her tears renewed as he hugged her softly, letting her cry before she spoke up. I broke a vase in my house when I went to bathroom and daddy yelled at me. I ran away, but now I can't find my house. I'm scared, please get me back to my daddy. She said in sobs, and Temari took the little cute girl in her arms to cradle and coo the crying little bundle as Naruto stood up with hardened eyes and fled his chakra in secret. Unbu code as 4 Unbu appeared in front of him and kneeled down. How Namikaze-sama? They shouted in unison, and he glared at their kneeled down forms and spoke. Several people around the open shops had stopped to see their military commander calling Unbu in front of him and listened in. If you were in the vicinity, why didn't you help this little girl? What would have happened if some drunk or psychopath would have got a hold of her instead of me? He asked coldly, and the Unbu team gulped from his tone, and the leader spoke up. But Namikaze-sama, according to your orders we are to look after the village and its security. He was cut off as Naruto spoke up. Is irrelevant. He said coldly, and all of them looked at him in shock as he spoke. If my forces can't even look after the well-being of a crying child in the death of night, then what security are you talking about? Would you have been responsible for reporting to her father that you saw and left his daughter alone? Answer me. He asked icily, and the 4 looked down in shame. The shinobi are stationed to the security of the village, correct? But if we can't protect our children, what good are you doing looking after the shinobi threats? They are the future of this village, and must be protected at all costs. Now I has a new mission for the 4 of you. He said, and they all looked down and nodded, his words piercing their hearts. Go and tell everyone what happened here and what is the most important thing to do. The security of the village is nothing if we can't protect its civilians. He said, and they nodded. And you 4 be ready to write a 5-page report on your actions tonight and what you learned. And if the report is not good enough, then be ready to be stripped of your Unbu masks after the finals. He said, and they nodded in unison, shivering from the little killing intent he was releasing. Dismissed. He said authoritatively, and he turned around to Temari, who was smiling proudly with the little girl in her arms as he heard clapping and saw the few awake people who saw everything clapping to him. Namikaze-sama, you're the best. The civilians rest easy seeing you look after us. One of the shopkeepers said as everyone nodded, and he smiled and shushed them up seeing the time and was blushing in embarrassment, as he turned to the little girl who had fallen asleep in Temari's arms and took her in his arms. Let's go and get her address from the admission form in my office and get this little girl home. He said, and she smiled and nodded as they went about, and did so walking to her house. They saw his father looking around frantically with tear stains on his cheeks as Temari put a hand on his shoulder and pointed to Naruto as the man's eyes widened when he saw his little girl, safe and sound, sleeping in the strongest man of the village's arms, sighing in relief. He kneeled down, bowing to Naruto as he was wide-eyed, and picked the man up. Thank you, Namikaze-sama, you are an angel to my family. You always look out for us. What would have I done if I couldn't find her? He said, and Naruto smiled, handing her to him as the father cradled his innocent sleeping child happily, making Temari smile. Why didn't you go and ask help at the shinobi desk? Naruto asked, and the man wiped his eyes, smiling sadly. I did, Namikaze-sama, but the man there was a bit drunk and said all shinobi were busy with the exams and didn't have time for silly civilian affairs. He said, making Naruto harden his eyes and Temari to scowl. Many shinobi from clans still looked at civilians' problems with disdain and a waste of time. Looks like they had to be taught a lesson, he mused. I apologize for their behavior. He said, and the father caught his hands and shook his head. No, please don't apologize, Namikaze-sama, you brought my daughter home personally, I couldn't. He said, but was cut off when Naruto raised his hand. No, my leadership had a hole, I shouldn't have had to find her in the first place. Your complaint should have been listened and reported to every patrolling shinobi through our specially coded seals. I had dispersed amongst them. Don't worry, I'll rectify it tomorrow, after I has a chat with my forces personally. He said, and the father nodded and thanked him again, stepping in his house as Naruto and Temari walked home with Temari wrapped around his arm. Looks like you has a busy day tomorrow, Naruto-kun. She whispered, and he nodded with a frown. Yes, I'll make sure everyone is treated equally, whether it be clan children or civilian orphans, as long as I'm in command. He said, and she smiled, kissing his cheek as they reached home and fell into bed in each other's arms. They fell asleep awaiting the adventures that were about to come in the next 2 days, especially the finals. Chapter 15. Next morning. Sunegaku no Sato. Namikaze households. Naruto woke up with a groan hearing the alarm clock ringing and slammed his hand on it, shutting it up. He had been up late last night due to their date already and he didn't want to get up. He felt soft lips and tingling warm breath over his neck and grunted. He opened his eyes to see his princess looking at him with a smile and a faint pink blush. She pecked his lips softly and he smiled, bringing her in for a hug. "You're up early today, Haim," he said softly, and she nodded on his chest while he played with her hair. "Howie has that small gathering of dignitaries at the resort today, remember?" She spoke softly, running circles on his chest, and he nodded, remembering it. He kissed the top of her head, making her smile and cuddle up to him. "We won't be able to have any alone time to the next couple of days, I suppose then?" he asked, and she nodded slowly on his chest. He pulled her closer by the waist and captured her lips in a soft kiss, making her moan in pleasure, and he smiled at him, tucking a lock of hair behind her ear, gently making her blush. "What do you say to a little shower then?" he asked, and she glared at him slightly. "No," she said flatly, and he looked at her in mock hurt. "Why not?" he asked, and she glared harder. "Because I know you will send me to the meeting with a limp," she said flatly with a blush, and he chuckled softly. "Oh, come on, I'm not that bad." He trailed off, seeing her flat look. "I'll be gentle," he whispered, kissing her cheek, and she blushed and looked at him angrily. She wanted to say no, but her cupped her cheeks and looked at her lovingly. "We don't know if we would get another chance again for the next 2 days or not." He spoke softly, kissing her neck, and she moaned and grabbed his head, cradling it in her arms while he kissed her neck. "No, stop, Naruto," she whispered half-heartedly, and he stopped, surprised at her refusal. "Why are you angry with me? Was I too rough last time?" he asked, gently kissing her on the cheek, and she smiled and shook her head. "No, remember what you promised me yesterday before Kankuro showed up?" she said, making him smile warmly and nod. "We'll have the complete day after the finals to ourselves, and I want you to make love to me all day. I want to has a family, Naruto," she whispered softly, and he smiled, kissing her forehead softly and pulled her in a bear hug. "I love you so much, Mari-chan. Alright, we'll do it after the finals, and I want a family too," he whispered softly, and she smiled and kissed his cheek. "But we can still has a shower together, right?" he asked, and she nodded as he stood up and quickly pulled her up bridal style, making her squeal in glee. "We will make out in the shower at the very least. You won't be able to keep me away from you completely," he said, walking in the bathroom while she snuggled in his chest and nodded. He put her down on her feet and took off his clothes in the shower. He heard the shower turning on, and looked back to see the silhouette of his wife in the steam, and smiled, walking in behind her. He wrapped his arms around her slender waist from behind and made her turn around in his arms. He looked at her dripping form and her naked body pressed against his, capturing her lips as the hot water flowed over them in between their kisses. Temari moaned as she felt his loving lips capture hers in a passionate kiss, and she kissed him back equally hungrily. They made out for 5 minutes in the shower, when she felt something hard between her legs, and knew what it was. He was hard already, and she knew he wanted her, but wasn't going any further. "You want it, don't you?" she asked softly, hugging him, and he nodded in her neck, brushing her wet hair to the side, making her smile. She held him for a few moments and kissed his cheek gently and brought her lips to his ear. "Make it quick," she purred in his ear softly, and he smiled and nodded. "Arigato," he whispered, pushing her against the wall and lifting up her left leg with his right arm, opening her love hole to him. She grabbed his stiff member in her hand and pulled him in a hug, stroking him softly, making him grunt in pleasure. "How much do you love me?" she asked softly, kissing his neck, and he grunted as she rubbed his tip on her opening while softly stroking him, teasing him within her hold. "More than you know," he grunted and tried to push in, when she held him back and kept stroking him. She gazed into his lust-filled eyes that were glazed from pleasure. She felt his hand go down to her pussy to rub, when she grabbed his wrist, and he looked at her in confusion. "What if I stop you right now?" She asked softly and kept stroking him, pulling his hand to her neck. Please don't, he grunted, thrusting lightly in her hand, and she smiled at hearing his vulnerable and needy voice. What if I do? She asked, feeling him getting stiffer than ever and twitching ever so lightly. You wouldn't, he said vulnerably, looking in her eyes while she kept stroking him. Oh, I would. She whispered mischievously, and he looked into her eyes to see her serious and not just teasing him. She really would do it. She was just playing with him. He put her leg down and unwrapped himself from her arms. She looked at him confused when he walked out of the shower, much to her surprise, grabbing a towel on his way out. She was just playing with him and had no plans to go all the way today. Naruto-kun? She asked, confused, as she walked out in a towel wrapped around her to see him putting on his pants and shirt. She was even more confused when he didn't answer her. Naruto-kun? She asked again in a small voice, and she gasped as she looked into his pained eyes. You really would have stopped, wouldn't you? He asked softly, and she was stunned at his question and didn't say anything. She was just playing with him and wasn't going to go the whole way. He saw her silence and smiled sadly. He put on his shirt and walked out, completely forgetting his jacket and headband along the way. He stopped as he put his hand on the doorknob and looked at her with hurt eyes, making her eyes water. You shouldn't play with our moments like that, he said softly, making her gasp as she brought her hands to her mouth in shock, and a tear rolled down her eye. She realized that she had hurt him and went too far with her prank. Naruto walked out, closing the door behind him, and she gasped and ran out to see him already gone, probably had flashed away, and started sobbing. She was so stupid. She knew how much he loved her, and his words rang in her mind. You shouldn't play with our moments like that. It was true. She had tried to prank him into making love. She had crossed a boundary she shouldn't have with her stupid joke and prank. She remembered his vulnerable voice in his last moments when he was with her in her arms. She should have realized he wasn't in the mood to pranks, and really wanted to go further, or she shouldn't have baited him on to the last moment like that. She needed to apologize to him. She glanced at the clock to see she was already running nearly on time to go to the gathering, and cursed inwardly. She decided to give him some time to calm down and make up to him later on. She put on her dress with the same kimono from the previous time she had worn to represent her village. She had to wear it on the 3 meetings, including the finals tomorrow. She got dressed in her same black kimono and pulled up her hair in a loose bun with the senbon that had a ruby embedded on one of its ends. She walked down the stairs of her house and put on her sandals. She glanced back into the empty house and her eyes watered. They had been so happy, and he had made her feel so special by taking her on that date last night to celebrate their decision for a family, and she had ruined it all with one of her stupid pranks. She missed him already. He should have been here kissing her and wrapping his arms around her while he walked her through the village. It felt weird to leave the house like that with such a heavy heart. She composed herself and walked out with a small sigh, locking the door behind her. Meanwhile, with Naruto. Naruto walked down the streets of the village with an emotionless mask marred over his face. It hurt him that she would play with him like that, and he didn't want to do anything stupid, so he had flashed away to the nearest marker as soon as he left the room. Maybe he had overreacted and she was just playing lightheartedly. He sighed tiredly. Maybe he should have listened to her first before just walking out. He was so confused with himself he didn't even realize when he had reached the Kazekage Tower and his office. He sat down on his desk, pumping chakra into the seals on them to send out a small beacon as 2 figures appeared in his office, bowing politely. Baki Dragon, call every shinobi under your commands to the clearing in front of the Kazekage Tower under the tower, he said emotionlessly, not looking up from the small file in front of him to see the 2 stupefied commanders of the village. Everyone. Both stuttered out in unison, and Naruto gazed up with cold, icy cerulean blue eyes with such intensity that both gulped. Did I stutter? He asked coldly, and both shook their heads furiously, seeing he was in no mood for any questions today, while holding their breaths as he turned his eyes. Both were shell-shocked at the sudden gathering of the forces they were commanded, and were building up their confidence to speak to their aggravated commander, when his voice cut in the silence like hot knife through butter. In 30 minutes, or don't return to your commands tomorrow. He said coldly, making their words die down in their throats, and sweat to roll down their heads when his blank face turned to them again. They saw he was not in a good mood today on one of those rare occasions. Dismissed, he said emotionlessly, and both ran out scrambling from the room, forgetting that they could use sunshine to leave completely. He turned his attention back to the file in front of him to take his attention of the tension that had formed in the morning between him and his Heim. He glanced at the clock to see it had been 25 minutes and stood up. He walked down the hallways of the tower as everyone made way for him, seeing his void aura that was surrounding him this morning. He stood in front of the crowd assembled to see two panting commanders kneel down in front of him. J. Are all here? Namikaze-sama, both said in between pants, and he nodded, motioning to them to stand with them, and gazed at the various shinobi, all standing there looking at their commander curiously, and he could hear the slight murmuring in between them. Is there something you all has that is more interesting to you to talk about rather than paying attention to your commander who is standing in front of you? He asked in a normal voice, not shouting or speaking loudly, and the whole forces turned deathly silent as the man they respected the most took command of them. The power and authority his voice held instantly commanded their complete attention. No, Namikaze-sama, he heard them say in unison and standing at attention, and he nodded. Tora Nico Inutori, step forward, he said in his normal voice, and the four Unbu stood in front of the crowd. The four knew why they were here from the events of last night. I was out late last night with my wife, and we were walking through the streets when I found a lost, crying little civilian girl, no older than 5 years, in the death of night. She was completely scared and alone, not knowing where she was, and wanted to go home. He started as all eyes focused on his commanding tone unblinkingly. These four. He motioned for them, who gulped beneath their masks, seeing every eye turned to them. Found their missions, the looking after internal security, much more prudent that to one of them to walk out and help the little crying child. They obeyed the rules of their commanding officers perfectly, choosing the mission over the little girl. He said, and all of them nodded, looking at the four Unbu who wanted to hold their heads down in shame, knowing what was coming next. Now I has a small question for all of you, he said, and all of them looked at their commander curiously. Do you think they made the right choice? Those who do, please raise their hands, he said, holding his hands behind his back, and gazed at all of them icily when almost 80% of the hands, including his Unbu and Thounin commanders, much to his shame, were within them. I see, he said, slowly looking at them, and smiled a small smile. Those who didn't raise their hands, please move to the left side, he said, and gazed at them, seeing they were all just newly minted genin, and smiled inwardly, seeing their nervous faces, thinking they had made the wrong choice. He turned to the rest of the forces with a smile, making them all smile proudly at their experienced choice when the words left his lips through his smile. I'm ashamed to call myself your commander. I guess I am not a capable leader, he said, as all of them broke out in protest after a moment of silence, absorbing his words, saying it wasn't true. He raised his hands slightly, and they turned silent as he spoke up. Think that all of you were in these four places, he said, turning to Baki and Dragon, who nodded in affirmative, seeing his firm tone, leaving no room for arguments. Think that the girl was in the hands of some psychopath or rapist, he said, as their blood ran cold, imagining a 5-year-old girl in such a fate. And you were supposed to report to me the next day, seeing her mutilated body, that you saw the girl last night, and instead of the one of you going off from the rules, you stuck by them, he said, when shame felt their hearts, and he continued. And you had to report it to the father whose child had suffered such a fate that you could have made a difference by disobeying the rules of your commanders, but you stuck by them, he said, and every eye averted his own. Now I ask, how many of you would have chosen the rules over the girl's safety? He asked, and no hand was raised, and he nodded appreciatively. Now you understand what it means to be a shinobi, he said, as all eyes turned up to him again. From this day on, you will not follow the rules blindly and make the choices you think are right. You aren't tools, you are shinobi. You has minds. You has hearts. Use them and think before you make a choice. If a situation like last night arises, and you all leave the mission parameters to do what was right, I would be proud to have called myself your commander, he said, as fire burned within their eyes hearing his words. Every civilian, shinobi, child and adult alike are our responsibility. Take out your hands, to help each other. Whether they be clan heads or civilians. His voice rang in the crowd and they nodded, knowing the small discrimination that he was trying to remove by that statement. My sensei didn't teach me much, but his first lesson I live by to this day, even if he himself never adopted it. He said as they all listened on with held breaths, knowing how important the next words must mean to their commander. Those who abandon rules in the shinobi world are scum, and that's true. He said, gaining nods from each and every one of them. But those who abandon even one of their comrades for their rules are even worse than scum. His words rung, stopping the nods. Each and every one is Suna is our comrade and our responsibility. From this day on, I shouldn't hear reports that we lost someone to fulfill the mission. If it doesn't work with Plan A, Gen, follow Plan B. He said when a hand raised from the crowd from a female chunin who blushed when he motioned to her to speak. She had a crush on the man in front of her and wanted to ask a question, but was surprised he was letting her instead of calling her off. What if Plan B fails to Namikaze-sama? She asked, and he smiled a little, making her blush intensify and all eyes to turn to him awaiting the answer. Well, the solution is simple and the one I live by personally. He said, gaining curious looks from everyone. If both fail, then create a plan C yourself. Improvise and try to cut as many losses as you could while trying to fulfill your objective. But never do so by abandoning a comrade. Sacrificing yourself is different and forfeiting a comrade to the wolves is different. Understand the difference, or you are no better than bandits. Are my words and my message to every shinobi on this side clear? He asked commandingly to all those who had raised their hands, and their respect for their commander increased tenfold and they nodded in unison. How Namikaze-sama? Their voice rang in unison, and he nodded, turning to the fresh genin, who didn't raise their hands, with a proud smile. I'm proud that our young blood has hearts of gold. Looks like the future of the sand is in safe hands. Making all of them embarrassed and got nods, when he turned to all of them looking at him curiously. He rose an eyebrow at their expectant gazes. What am I, a baboon doing a performance? He asked in an amused and light-hearted tone, getting face faults throughout the crowd at his reversal in behavior, and he smirked as his authoritative voice rang again. We has the Chunin exams final tomorrow, Suna shinobi, and we need our village secure. Now get your asses in gear and do some work. Dismissed. He said loudly, and all the forces scrambled back to their posts when he heard snickering behind him to see an amused Gaara and a laughing Kankuro, and sighed. That was interesting. Gaara said in an amused tone, making him smile. I knew I made the right choice choosing you, Naruto. You really should take my hat, you know. He said, and Naruto smirked and walked past him as Gaara handed him a small official sealed scroll that he pocketed with a smile. No, you can keep the paperwork and I can keep the shinobi affairs. It's better that way. He said and flashed away when a sand tendril pierced where he was a moment ago, making Gaara growl. I swear I'll get the secret to his paperwork technique, whatever it is, one day. He said, and Kankuro followed him laughing to the gathering for which they were already late. Now he understood why he had chosen this time. With all of the outsiders attending the gathering, the forces were almost free through a small gap at that moment. Meanwhile, with Temari. Temari entered the resort in her elegant clothing with the elegance of a princess and saw almost all heads turn to the representative of Suna exam finals and started greeting her happily. She smiled a small fake smile, greeting them all formally and dismissing them as politely as she could when she saw Tsunade coming her way, and much to her surprise didn't has a cup of sake in her hands. Temari, I was looking for you. She chirped happily, and Temari rose an eyebrow and nodded. What can I do for you, Tsunade-sama? She asked, getting a smile from the woman. You know I has always liked you. She said, gaining a small nod in return when Tsunade smiled. And that is a really pretty ring. And the design of it is rather interesting. She said, emphasizing on the word interesting, and Temari covered it with her other hand with a small nervous smile. Thank you, Tsunade-sama. She said with a nervous smile, and Tsunade smiled widely, taking a small chicken skewer in her hand and walked beside her. And you know the delicacies of Suna are rather delicious. she said, taking a bite from the skewer, and Temari smiled from the compliment. She had made the arrangements and she was proud to hear a heartfelt compliment. But yesterday I visited a rather interesting new restaurant in the shopping district and I must say the food there is delicious, she said, and Temari looked at her curiously, putting some food on her plate from the table as they walked side by side. Really, which one is that, Tsunade-sama? She asked innocently, and Tsunade smiled. It has a rather peculiar speciality and has originated from Konoha. I'm sure you must know of it. Ichiraku's ramen, she said in a low voice, only audible to her, and Temari was pulled aside by Tsunade as she gulped, seeing her sweet smile. They were in the corner out of everyone's earshot now. Your ring has the shape of a nine-tailed fox. Naruto's favorite ramen stand, Ichiraku's, moved its business from Konoha to Suna of all places after 30 years of business there, just when their business was booming. Those coincidences are too much. He is alive, isn't he? She asked desperately with teary eyes, and Temari sighed, seeing her motherly voice, and nodded when Tsunade hugged her tightly, glumping her like a mother. I knew it. My Gaki wasn't one to die so easily. How is he? He is happy here, right? She asked rapidly, in a soft and caring voice, and Temari nodded with a small smile. He is here, Tsunade-sama, and he is very happy. He misses you dearly. The only one he still cares about from the leaf are you and Shizune-san, she said kindly in a soft voice, and Tsunade's eyes softened with a fond smile, and tears flowed down her eyes as she pulled her behind a small plant out of everyone's eyesight. So he is your fiancé too, right? She asked softly, taking her hand with the ring, gazing at it happily, making Temari smile and shake her head in negative and cut her off as she tried to voice her confusion. He is my husband, now, Tsunade-sama, she said softly, and Tsunade's eyes widened in shock as her tears renewed, and she glumped her again, much to her embarrassment, but saw the happiness in her eyes and the true concern for her lover. Oh, he chose so well. Now I'm sure too has blonde grandchildren, she said, and Temari blushed and looked down, making Tsunade beam at no denial to her words. Oh my god, you too has that planned too, she said gleefully, and Temari's blush intensified, and she nodded when Tsunade asked the next question. Where is he? I need to meet him, please, she said desperately, and Temari looked at her wide-eyed. But Tsunade-sama, the gathering. She was cut off as Tsunade shooed her hand to the party. Fuck the gathering. They can burn for all I care, she said bluntly, making Temari wide-eyed, and now understood why her husband always said she was too blunt for her own good. She was tempted to make her go and see Naruto, but remembered the morning and looked down. Tsunade-sama, he is really busy with the exams and all, she said nervously, making Tsunade scowl and cut off her protest before she could speak. But I promise, you'll see him tomorrow one way or the other, she said, making Tsunade raise an eyebrow at her cryptic words. I promise, she said firmly, and Tsunade nodded slowly. She was too happy with the news she had heard anyway to be negative, and couldn't wait to meet her blonde Gaki. She pulled her with her, wiping her eyes, and their conversation went on, with the two lost in their own conversations as Temari told her how Naruto was and if he was fine. Well, again and again, much to her chagrin. She was happy that the cages had a separate gathering and she didn't have to see any other shinobi to ruin her mood. Evening. Naruto walked into the gates of his eyes to see the door locked and was surprised that Temari hadn't returned until now. He unlocked the door and stepped in. He pulled off his sandals and kept them in the shoe rack, walking in. He went to the kitchen and towards the fridge for a bottle of water when two slender arms slid around his waist from behind and a small soft form pressed itself on his back, making him smile. I'm sorry. He heard a small whisper and brought him in front of her, picking her up and sat her up on the counter to see her puffy red eyes and cheeks, and knew she must have been crying. He cupped both of her cheeks gently and smelt the smell of liquor and saw the slight blush on her cheeks over their puffiness. Haim, has you been drinking? He asked softly in a concerned voice, and she smiled and nodded with droopy eyes, pointing her fingers to a small amount on the empty bottle in her hand with a small slurry smile. Just a little. He heard her small whisper with a hiccup and glanced back to see their cabinet of liquor open and several empty bottles lying around the ground, making him sigh as he pulled her close in a hug. You shouldn't be drinking so much, Haim. It's not good for you. he said softly, cradling the drunk girl in his arms while she snuggled in his embrace with a sob. It made me forget, she said with a hiccup, and he rubbed her back softly, making her feel fuzzy and smile, feeling his hands over his. She tightened her hold on him and smiled. She missed feeling this safety even for a few hours. Forget what? He asked faintly and heard another soft sob and kept rubbing her back faintly. I felt so scared that you hated me after I made fun of our moment like that, she said, now crying in his arms and hugging him tightly. Naruto smiled softly and hugged her gently and brought her sniffing and cute face in front of him, wiping it softly like a little child as she giggled slurrily with a hiccup. I could never hate you, Mari-chan, he whispered softly, and she looked at his warm and concerned eyes and hugged him. I am sorry, really, I didn't mean to, I just. She was cut off as Naruto pressed his lips onto her softly in a small kiss, and looked at her lovingly. It's all right, he said reassuringly, and she sniffled in his arms like a little child. Na-kun, she whispered, and he smiled, brushing her blonde unruly locks softly in his hair. How, Mari-chan? He asked softly, and she smiled, snuggling in his chest. Aishitaru, she whispered softly, making him smile and kiss her head softly as he cradled his cute girl in his arms. Aishitaru, Mari-chan, he said softly, and she nodded in his chest, feeling nice in his arms. Na-kun, take me to bed, she said softly, and he smiled and swept her off her feet and carried her to their room and put her on the bed gently. He tried to walk away when she caught his wrist and looked at him pleadingly. Stay, she whispered, biting her lip, and he nodded with a soft smile, taking off his jacket and got into bed with her. She cuddled up to him and her eyes drooped from the alcohol in her system. Na-kun, I'll make it up to you, I'm sorry, she whispered with a cute yawn, and her eyes drooped in sleep, making him smile. He brushed her hair softly and kissed the top of her head while she lulled herself to his rhythmic heartbeat. Sleep now, we'll talk tomorrow, he whispered, and she nodded as he felt a small drop on his neck and saw a tear leak from her eye before she fell asleep, making him smile sadly. My Barker blonde wife, I love you too much, he whispered, closing his eyes, as he looked at the softly breathing mop of sandy blonde hair on his chest with a small smile and pulled her closer while he too fell asleep. Next morning, Temari woke up to a splitting headache and sat up a bit, holding her head with a groan. I drank too much, she whispered to herself, feeling the intense headache, and saw the empty bed beside her and teared up. She buried her face in her hands and cried to herself. He didn't come home, he hates me, she sobbed to herself, when the door to the room opened, startling her, and in came Naruto with a tray full of breakfast. He got into bed and put the tray on her lap, kissing her head softly, making her blush from his tender treatment. She watched him with childlike eyes, sniffing a bit when she saw his warm smile. He picked up a small tablet from the tray and put her in front of her mouth with his finger under her chin. Mari-chan, open your mouth, he said softly, and she opened it a bit as he placed the pill in and put the glass of orange juice to her lips as she swallowed it and saw him sit beside her and pull her close to him in a warm hug, rubbing her arm and kissing her head softly, making her snuggle in his arms. My Barkerheim, what were you thinking drinking so much? You had 7 bottles of sake, from what I counted in the cabinet, he said softly, scolding her, and she hugged him tightly. 10. She whispered, and he looked at her surprised with a mild glare, making her look down. I had 3 at the party too, she whispered, biting her lip, and saw his glare, when she heard him sigh and pull her in a bear hug. You're not angry, she whispered, and he chuckled softly, surprising her. I think you don't remember last night, ho. I forgave you last night, when you fell asleep in my arms, Haim, he said softly, making her smile childishly in his arms as she tightened her hold on him. You were with me last night, she asked, blushing, and he nodded, kissing her head, brushing her blonde locks. Of course I was. Where would I go other than my Haim's arms? Plus, you weren't letting me go, you know, he said playfully, and she punched his chest softly with a blush. Of course I wasn't, you're mine, she said softly, and he chuckled and nodded. How, and you're mine, Haim. Now has breakfast. You skipped on dinner for sake last night too. You need the most important meal of the day. He said softly and started feeding her much to her embarrassment, but she liked being treated like that with his warm smile and loving eyes looking at her so tenderly. She fed him back slowly with the same affection as he moved the tray aside and sat with her settled on his lap. He kept running his fingers in her hair softly. I was worried, you know. So much sake can harm you. He said softly and she nodded in his chest. I'm sorry. She whispered and he kissed her lips softly and gave her a heartwarming smile. But I'm glad you drank at home, where you were safe, and could sleep in my arms with me watching over you. He said softly and she looked down blushing a bit, making him curious. I went to Kankuro and Gaara too, you know. She whispered and he looked at her with his eyebrows shot up and heard her. Well, Gaara told me to come back and that you would forgive me instantly. She whispered and he smiled and kissed her forehead softly. And he was right. He said softly and she nodded with a blush. But I was scared and my gaze turned to the liquor cabinet and she trailed off and he smiled and hugged her. Looks like I'll have to refill the cabinet knee. He said playfully and she giggled and nodded. The finals are today, Haim. He said softly and she nodded in his chest seeing they had a couple of hours and looked at him. We should take a bath, I'll prepare the tub. She said blushing and he chuckled and nodded. How and today only a bath and no making out or anything? He said and she tried to argue, when he put his fingers on her lips. I don't want to break my promise now that we have skipped out a day, another won't matter. But be ready because tomorrow, I'll make love to you from dawn till dusk. He said softly rubbing her cheek and she nodded with a blush dreaming how good it would feel to make love for so long. They took a simple bath that took half an hour with them talking to each other softly about their looking forward to their start of a family before they got out and started getting dressed. Temari put on her underwear as she looked at him in his pants and got behind him wrapping her arms around his naked torso feeling his warm body she loved so much. Where are you going to be today, Naruto? She asked and he smiled looking at the scroll with the official Kazekid seal with a small smile. Oh, Gaara has given me a special duty today. He said softly and brought her hand up from his chest kissing it softly making her smile and turn him around. She wrapped her slender arms around his neck and looked at him lovingly while he kept his hands on her hourglass naked waist in just her black laced bra and panties. What duty? She asked softly and he smiled mischievously and shook his head. Oh, you'll see, it's a surprise. He said and she looked at him pleadingly when he gave her a soft kiss with a smile. You'll be surprised, all right. He said grinning making her pout and causing him to laugh as they started getting ready for the day. That's it to this part. If you enjoyed it then like, share and subscribe to the next part. It's going to be more interesting and also check out the other playlist, hope you would like them too.